leadership report tonight. There's a number of things that will be coming up. Marcus, do you want to raise anything before we go straight to Ossie?
Nope, I know we've got a little bit during new business, but I'll hold off until then.
Okay. Okay then. Justin, are you I see you. Are you the person I'm calling on?
Yes, Shauna should be here as well.
Do you want us to go to something else first?
No. No. Nope. So John Paul, I can message her, but we can go ahead and get started too.
Great. Do you want to be the presenter, or do you want me to bring the presentation up?
That's what we did the last time, and I thought it worked pretty well.
Yep, no problem. You have been made presenter, so okay. You can bring it up.
All right. So share content. So can you see my screen or no?
Not yet.
Okay, so I still need to push the button. Share that. Now you can, right?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, so thank you for having us. As everyone knows, I'm Justin Tooley. I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff at the Office of the State Superintendent for Education. Shauna Young, the Chief of Staff, should be joining me very shortly, but we can go ahead and get started. We have a lot of information and ground to cover tonight in this presentation, so I'd like to get through the presentation and then we'll open it for questions because I think a lot of your questions may be answered on different things as we go along with more information. So you can also, if it's okay, John Paul, put questions in the chat, and we'll also look at those too and answer those at the end. So if you think of something and then we're off in somewhere else, feel free to put your questions in the chat and we can look at those too. Okay. All right. The district's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the continued use of social distance measures will require schools to provide both in-person and distance learning for the 2020-21 school year. The district's existing regulations only contemplate the collection of attendance when a student physically attends school. As a result, we will need to adjust existing attendance collection procedures to accommodate distance learning for school year 2020-21. The purpose of this presentation is to give you a framework of how we're thinking about collecting attendance for distance learning. And we would like to present to you some of our current efforts on distance learning. We will also provide some background on existing attendance laws and regulations to level set everyone's knowledge. And we would also like to share our framework and our thinking for collecting attendance and present to you some of our next steps. So our current efforts. As the District of Columbia prepares for reopening, the city is looking ahead to a school year that will be unlike any we've experienced before. Local education agencies may offer a variety of in-person and distance learning options to students and families, while ensuring that the educational experience for all students is consistent across different settings and transitions between them are also seamless. While much of our collective preparations will be rightly driven by public health considerations, we must also sustain our focus on student learning and growth. We know how hard educators, families, and students have been working over the last few months and have heard anecdotal accounts of students who have benefited from remote learning. We must ensure that all students have access to a safe and supportive learning environment that delivers rigorous and standards-aligned content that prepares our students to succeed in school and life. As the state education agency, OSSE, is committed to supporting LEAs as they prepare to meet this need. Core to this planning effort is setting a clear and high bar for what constitutes quality continuous education for all students. These guiding principles are intended to provide LEAs, families, and caregivers with clear and consistent expectations for the continuous education that will take place during the upcoming school year. They are intended to help LEAs develop effective and equitable continuous education models that strive to meet the needs of all students. They should also support families' understanding of what they can expect to see for their students in the upcoming school year. While these guiding principles acknowledge certain legal obligations, they extend well beyond that. They offer a target for excellence rather than a floor for compliance. The guiding principles are divided into 3 pillars: high expectations, equity and access, and family engagement. Each pillar encompasses 2 to 4 guiding principles. The guiding principles collectively set a vision for excellence in the context of continuous education. We are asking for feedback on these guiding principles. You will also find an online survey at the link marked feedback. So that's on the screen. So you can find a link to our continuous learning guidance, and then also additional distance learning resources for LEAs and families, as well as our survey tool to provide feedback on our continuous learning guide. We encourage you to review these resources and share them with your respective constituencies. So next, I'll talk a little bit of what we've been doing to support planning for distance learning in the 1920 school year. So our existing regulations give the superintendent the authority to waive requirements on school calendars. By regulation, a school year is 180 instructional days, and an instructional day consists of 6 hours, which includes lunch, recess, and class breaks. But due to COVID, we had to modify and waive these requirements for the 1920 school year. And to do that, LEAs had to submit a waiver application that included questions pertaining to the LEA's implementation of continuous learning. To apply for a waiver on their calendar, an LEA had to submit an implementation plan that included questions on the following: instructional continuity, monitoring students' participation in progress, supporting special populations, student grades, and supporting students after the emergency. These distance learning implementation plans were valuable in helping us shape policies and supports to implement distance learning in the future. We've approved all of these LEA waivers, and we'll share them on our website by the end of the month. For school year 2021, LEAs will undergo a very similar process, but respond to the continuous learning guidance that I asked for your feedback on the prior slide. They will do this when they submit their school calendars for the upcoming school year. So I wanted to give you all of that sort of background information on how we're thinking about and supporting this distance learning in the district in response to COVID. And now I want to sort of ground us all in what is the main item on our agenda tonight to share with you, which is about how we are thinking about collecting attendance. And I know that it's been a long time, I think, since the state board has talked about attendance. So I thought it would be helpful if we just gave a quick level setting on attendance. So this is not a full legal review of our attendance laws and regulations, but I think it will provide hopefully some context to those that are new and maybe not be familiar with as much of the background here. So this slide summarizes relevant local statutes pertaining to attendance. Broadly, OSSE collects and reports data on attendance. We promulgate rules on governing attendance and provide attendance and reporting requirements. We are implementing this law to comply with our statutory requirements. The State Board of Education approves rules for enforcing school attendance requirements. So you'll see your code citation there as well. LEAs in schools are required to collect attendance daily. They report that data to OSSE and report truant students to relevant agencies for follow-up. Parents are required to send their children to school if they are of compulsory age. And an absence of a minor without an excuse is unlawful. We are not proposing changes to the underlying statutes governing attendance, but this framework for collecting distance learning attendance would satisfy these legal requirements. So what I'm saying here is we are continuing to still have the same general legal rules around attendance, but our method of collection is changing. So we're not changing any laws here is the key takeaway here. So the DC municipal regulations operationalize these legal requirements for collection and reporting of attendance data. Rules require schools to maintain attendance records and require a complete attendance record with certain components. Schools must also have a staff member serve as an attendance monitor and fulfill certain duties. And schools are required to submit final attendance data to OSSI 60 days after the end of the school year. There are also a series of notification and interventions required by students when they miss a certain number of unexcused absences. For example, a student will be referred to a school-based student support team to address their attendance of a certain number of absences. If the student is between the ages of 5 and 13, they are referred to CFSA after 10 unexcused absences. And then if a student is between the ages of 14 and 17, they get 15 unexcused absences, full day absences, they are referred to Court Social Services Division of Superior Court of the District of Columbia and to the Office of the Attorney General Juvenile Section. And all of that is codified in law and also in our regulations. Regulations also define what constitutes an excused absence and the manner in which those excuses must be provided to the school by the parent. All of these provisions would also stay the same. And then finally, just at a high level, how do we get all of this information? So broadly, schools collect attendance data daily and send it to OSSI through NIFT. OSSI runs quality checks. We make sure that a student's attendance record is complete. So it has the date, it has their present, absence, and we make sure it conforms to our data rules. LEAs and schools get a set of dashboards to monitor student attendance and data quality pertaining to attendance. This helps them take action on their data. So as you know, we've had significant conversation locally about attendance and attendance interventions, and we know that schools and LEAs need to see their attendance data in actionable ways so they can follow up with students, and we provide those dashboards back to them with their data. At the end of the year, we report final attendance data, we publish attendance rates, and we issue our annual attendance report. Broadly, the framework of attendance collection and reporting would also stay the same. But what exactly changes? What must change is the collection of attendance when a student is attending school remotely. So remember, attendance by law is collected to authenticate a student's presence for the purpose of a student's safety and welfare. The student is in their expected educational setting on a particular day, and the student is exposed to education. We know that there are many other things that we also care about. For example, student engagement, whether they're doing their work, their participation, and so on. But attendance doesn't really capture all of that. It's one piece of information of a lot of pieces of information. But in remote learning, some things change that are beyond our control. A student doesn't come to the physical building, and direct student supervision isn't with a school anymore. It's with a guardian, a parent, or a caretaker. The student and the school staff are in two separate places. Schools may also be providing instruction through synchronous instruction, which means they're giving real-time live instruction. So kind of like I'm doing with you right now, that would be synchronous. But asynchronous instruction, it could be a recording. John Paul is going to record this video and post it. That would be a synchronous instruction. Both are equally valid and both can be done well. So specifically, what we would have to change is that for the upcoming school year in 2021, schools will report daily attendance using the following types: in-person and remote. We're not proposing any change to in-person attendance. So if the student is physically going into the school building, their attendance would be collected the exact same way as it is right now. But for a student to be marked present when attending school remotely, they would have to meet the following standard. If the LEA is using a learning management system, the student will need to be authenticated and engaged in education consistent with the LEA's prescribed policy. So a learning management system is like a software application where they're providing their instruction. So if they're using that, you can see students' logons, you can see you can track what they're doing and how much time that they spend in a certain section. You have all of that functionality there. But some LEAs don't have an LMS, and some might want additional flexibility not to use their LMS. The LEA must make And in that case, an LEA must make one-on-one contact with a student for the day to authenticate their presence and provide daily evidence of engagement consistent with an LEA's policy. So let me back up a little bit. So what we're going to do, what we're proposing that we do, is that we would collect remote attendance, and that attendance, a student that's attending school remotely would be marked present if they met these two requirements. So they could, if the school is using a learning management system, they could authenticate their attendance through the learning management system. But if they're not, they have to make one-on-one contact with the student and provide some evidence of engagement consistent with their policy. And we would also have schools write out what their attendance policies are going to be for sufficient authentication and engagement in their continuous learning plans. So where do we go from here? So this was a lot of information, and we are trying to present it to you for the first time to wrap your heads around and collect some additional, some of your first thoughts around our policy framework. We will also issue emergency or proposed regulations to begin the school year. Remember, emergency regulations stay in effect for 120 days. We will also have to give LEAs technical guidance on collecting daily attendance. We do this every year. We have to do this to abide by the law. We will also publish our continuous learning guidance and other policy documents relating to attendance. So again, I'm asking you to take a look at those continuous learning guidance, the resources that we have on the website, and provide feedback to those. We will ask LEAs to provide an application for their calendar that includes their continuous learning plan. And then we will propose regulations with your approval, which we have to do under existing law, to keep our attendance policy in place for the rest of the 2020-2021 school year. All right. So I know you probably have a lot of questions, and I went through a lot of content, and I'm going to stop sharing so I can see your face and make sure everybody is still with me. John Paul, oh, hit stop sharing. Okay. All right.
Thank you. So we do have a number of questions, so I'm just going to go in the order of when I heard the little beep on my screen. Dr. Kasoy.
Hi, thank you so much, Justin, for that presentation and for clarification on some of these very thorny issues right now. I just have a question about the, you said LMS, the learning management system. What determines whether a school has that or not? Is that their choice whether to get that, or is it like a DCPS charter thing?
Hi, folks. This is Shauna. I wasn't here at the very beginning, so I want to say hi. So I'm tag teaming with Justin. Most schools have some version of this, which is essentially just a way that they deliver and or track instructional materials and or other educational academic services to students and families. Some have very sophisticated services and some have more limited ones, and how they are using online tools to deliver that information varies, particularly in the smaller charters. So DCPS has a large system that integrates with many of their other systems in how they are allowing students to log in to get academic work, et cetera. And there are other sort of attachments that you can add onto these systems. Some very small schools may not have something as sophisticated, or may choose not to, purchase or implement some of the other more sophisticated trackers. So almost everyone has something that on paper would categorize as an LMS, but what they're used for and how varies.
Okay, but we can count on the fact that all DCPS schools would have a LMS, is what you're saying.
DCPS implements that at the LEA level, yes.
Right. And then just one more quick question related. So Justin mentioned that if schools don't have that, they would need to provide evidence of personal one-on-one contact and engagement. Are there some examples of what that might look like? Like, would that be a screenshot of the Zoom or whatever they're using? Like, what would that look like for teachers and for schools to provide that?
Yeah, I think it could look a number of different ways. It could mean that an individual educator had contact with a student and received work from a student. So like as simple as that. It could mean that, there's a specific kind of online check-in that happens every day, either through Zoom that is not attached to a system for some other reason, or through a different kind of documented participation or exit ticket type situation. I think it could vary a little bit depending on and by grade, by age, by school, how they would define that.
And engagement, I guess that's what I'm also getting. I can understand why we need that. So it's not just a student signing on and then walking away. I'm assuming that's why, right?
That's
But
right.
what, yeah. What would constitute, like, is it just, yeah, what would that look like? Like, what would constitute engagement enough to count?
I think it depends, right? I think, and it could very much depend largely similarly on grade. There may be a high school, for example, where their expectation to meet presence is to, to be documented, checking in on multiple classes with multiple streams of work. Whereas in elementary school, that could mean something very different for a younger child. And so it's more that it's more appropriate for individual LEAs to be able to document what that means. The intent is not to document classroom participation per se, which is not something we do now or ever have done or is appropriate, but
Yeah.
it is allowing a school to set what that level is appropriate to their instructional platform, their academic expectations, and their plan for distribution and checking of work, etc.
Okay, so it comes from the LEA, what that looks like. Got
Correct.
it.
And the intent is that they would be able to articulate that for themselves, for teachers, and for students up front, and that they've done some thinking about that in order to meet this standard.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sutter.
Thank you. Mine is sort of a follow-on to Dr. Gasoy's, which is, how are you going to judge sufficient, or how will you evaluate that in the plans that LEAs submit? Or where are you in your thinking on that?
Yeah, I think we anticipate that it could look in a number of different ways. And so what is more important is that they have a standard for contact and for a definition of academic connection, whatever that means, and that they have a way to implement that across their school.
Got it. That's helpful. I was thinking mostly of schools within Ward 6, like Apple Tree, which is all early childhood, which will likely create a very different kind of plan for engagement than will Digital Pioneers Academy, where everyone is already one-to-one and online all the time, than will a Montessori school like Capitol Hill. CHML is a DCPS school, but Shining Stars or some of the others. So thank you. That's helpful.
And again, Jess, I think it's important to add is that, we're not like, I don't want people to think of this as like heavy-headed and bureaucratic, is that you send us a document and we reject it and we send it back and that's it. No, we don't do that with our plans, right? Because that doesn't serve anybody. What we have done with the first round of implementation plans is we might go back and say, first, we make sure, have they answered the questions and are they complete? There's no like major legal red flags or anything like that. We focused in some key places and then like check for clarity. Like, could a lay person understand very clearly what they're doing? And if not, it's not like we send them back and say we have rejected. We go back and forth until we get them to a place where we all feel comfortable.
Great. That's helpful. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I think Sean was going to say something else.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that there's a plan for implementation. So it's not the idea in this case also is that it's not a philosophical statement. It is a plan that is documented. Here's how we would do it, and here's how we would empower educators and families to do this policy also.
Yeah, that seems really important, making sure that parents know how to help their students demonstrate the engagement so as to be allowed to be counted present for a day.
Thank you. Ms. McClay.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
So my question actually has to deal with the digital divide and some of the questions that we are hearing from parents on how tracking of attendance would deal with our parents who are low income or don't have the necessary equipment. For instance, I'm hearing questions from parents who are using 4 kids all using the same computer or a phone. One can't log on to class because another has a class at the same time. Or the computer is broken and I can't sign into class. So looking at that, even if they have a management system or the teacher might email and they can't get to an email system, how are we worrying about those students and attendance, as well as repercussions for students who are not meeting the attendance standards? Could you talk a little bit about those as well?
That's a great question, Ashley, and I appreciate it. I think the first consideration related to digital divide and access to devices in order to participate in school is a big issue, and one that the city and the district and individual LEAs have addressed a lot of resources towards, and which will also be, I think, which is also a complementary piece of the information we are soliciting related to the guiding principles for remote learning. And so I know that the city is continuing to invest a lot of funding and resources towards this and instructing LEAs to figure out exactly how to ensure that that educational services can be accessed and to provide families and individual students the best access to that, whether that be in their home or via other places and forms as social distancing requirements change. So I think one of the reasons why that we wanted to make sure that the options for submitting attendance were not only, for example, logging in through an LMS, is to encourage LEAs to think about how this will be implemented with their individual communities of students and students within their community, no matter what level of access they have, and to ensure that there are pathways to enable engagement or acknowledgement of that student engagement and work. And so that's another reason why we think it may look very different for different schools, but also that there may need to be flexibility built in for schools to be able to enable that, enable students to access the information in different ways. As it relates to individual students, I think the one thing that we are not trying to do is to put in place any new individual accountabilities here for students. We do want to make sure we have the information to know what is happening, but we are not, none of these, this ability to collect attendance for children who are learning remotely is not linked to any new enforcement or in terms of what that means for an individual student, but we felt it was important to document at the at the state level or the school level to see how students are accessing it. We also anticipate that one of the things that we know is that things are going to change, and so we know that where a student is learning in August and September may be different in February, may be different in May, and so we wanted to find a way to accommodate getting that information so that in a few months from now or a year from now, we're able to come back and say, here's what happened and here's how that played out.
So another thing, I think maybe just as like a technical consideration too, is that our existing regulations outline what are excused absences. And there's a list of excuses, like when school is when school is canceled due to like weather. One of them is actually like malfunctioning equipment. And then there's sort of like a catch-all phrase in our existing regulation, like consistent with an LEA policy. So that's certainly something that we will definitely think about as we go along, sort of like drafting out the details. And we feel that we should be able to cover those things that are like super like of no fault to the student, right? Which it sounds like is the basic premise of your question. The other piece though is like, and I think this is something that we have talked about internally, is that we've also gotten to see our LEAs respond to this new situation in real time, and we saw LEAs really rise to the occasion in assessing what their needs of their individual families were, pointing them to resources, providing them support, providing them with technical assistance to set things up. And I think not only was it particularly inspiring to see that and how nimble and responsive people were to this need, but it's something that I think from the plans, and I think when you see them, you will see schools sort of being very nimble and thoughtful about doing this too. So it's not only just the procuring devices is only one side of the equation. It's also like making sure that you're being responsive to families and connecting them deeply with the technology. And we're starting to see some of that.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Shauna. It sounds like you guys have really taken a lot of time and effort really looking to track this attendance and using it for good purposes. So I really appreciate all of your hard work.
Thank you. Dr. O'Leary.
And the first thing is just to sort of piggyback on what Ashley was talking about. How are students who do not go back to school? These are all back to school questions. How do students who do not go back to school for personal or health reasons and do not have virtual learning, how are they going to be counted for attendance if it's not their fault?
Well, I think this is an attempt actually to document exactly what you're talking about. We're anticipating that there's going to be a lot of flux, but those students will still be enrolled. So it's the duty of the school to connect with those students and understand whether or not they have they are going to be choosing or are required to stay home, and that might change throughout the year, right? If mom and dad gets exposed to COVID and you have to quarantine for a few days, or there's some other health thing that requires us all to quarantine for a few days, or school schedules change mid-year. So this is an attempt to enable us to track for those students who are home. And we know that our schools are already thinking a lot about students who will have to be home, students who will choose to be home, and students who will be assigned to be home. And in any of those cases, this attendance could be used.
No, that's very helpful. As I said, these really are short. The rest of them are short answer questions. What happened? But Justin, you were talking about grade 3 to grade 4 to 13 or something, the ages where students' attendance, but you didn't mention students who are 18 or over. All right, now those are basically seniors, but do the seniors, is anyone responsible for the seniors, for students who are 18 and over and still in high school as far as their attendance is concerned?
So I'll say that I think the law is that those ages are related to compulsory age schooling, which
Right.
just means that at a certain point, a student is considered legally an adult and could leave school without being in violation of the law. But for a student that's enrolled, they're held to the same standards for attendance. If a student is enrolled, we expect them to attend, and the school works with them regardless of their age if they're enrolled.
No, I understand that, but I'm just wondering about, because the ones who are underage, there are certain regulations that the parents and everyone have to follow, or they will be chastised. Let's use that word. All right, but for an 18-year-old student, they are on their own as far as just getting their grade or not getting their grade because of their age. Is that fact? Is that
Yes, in the
basically
sense
true?
that truancy laws do not apply to students who are above the compulsory or below the compulsory age of schooling.
Okay, thank you. Now the rest of them really are short. All right. When do the LEAs submit their calendars?
They submit calendars over the summer.
No, but over the summer is too vague for me. Is there a date?
generally they're beginning to submit their calendars around now. And they can change over the course of the year. And by calendars, we mean the days that they intend to be open. So that is, I believe that we start collecting those in June, and I don't know the specific date.
Okay, so that the huge LEA has, all the schools have to have them in at the same time. For the charter schools that are individual LEAs, is there any kind of a deadline?
We have technical deadlines, meaning that we set deadlines by which we request LEAs submit start of school dates in order that we can help them get their systems connected in time to do things like collect attendance. And those deadlines generally occur 30 to 60 days before the start of the school year in order that like the actual computer connections between their systems and our systems can be made. I don't have the specific deadline in front of me, but we can get back to you on how those look.
Okay, and the other
Throughout the year, but we ask that they let us know so that we know, on August 15th, we know some data is going to start coming through the pipeline.
are all of the LEAs closed right now?
No. Some are continuing through the upcoming week.
But at the end of this next week, all the LEAs will be shut down.
I would have to check. There's still a set that I think we're going through next week based on the information that I have through the 19th.
And the last question I have is about LMS. Why wouldn't an LEA have an LMS? And you said it's financial. Is that the only reason?
I think it depends a little bit on the academic structure of the school. It's I would say like in general, in the industry of education, it's pretty standard to have a system, but it is not always configured towards like your parents and students necessarily, if you've never used it that way before, right? If you're used to doing school in school and you don't, and you're a small LEA, and you have not used that to deliver information back to parents and families, you've had other, lo-fi ways of doing that, it may not exist in that way. I don't know enough to particularly speculate on which schools do and don't have something in the like formal definition of a learning management system, and it all, which can range from like something very small to something with lots and lots of bells and whistles. But generally, these are just tools that schools have to administer school. But in what ways they are configured and have purchased all the functionality to use, in what sophistication can depend.
I'm just saying this because we're going to be talking all about the next school year, but we have no idea what the next year is going to look like at the beginning because of the virus, and we don't know if we've peaked. We know we're going down, but we also know that other places in the United States, they're starting to go up again. So what, and this is just a question that went through my mind. Should having an LMS be part of a charter school application?
I'd have to defer to PCSB on the level of detail that they're asking related to individual systems.
But I'm just saying with what we've experienced for the last it sounds to me like it should be mandatory for every LEA to have an LMS so that you can see what their attendance is like. I'm just throwing that out. Thank you. Thank you for all of your answers. You don't have to go any further with that, Shannon, because I know what
I will just clarify that it is required that LEAs submit attendance. Just the type of system that they use to do that may vary from school to school. So all LEAs currently submit attendance. It's just the way that they would be tracking it moving forward. But happy to answer more questions.
Thank you. Mr. Parker.
Thank you, Shauna and Justin, for sharing. I really found your presentation helpful. One, just flagging, in the presentation, it seems the link to the guidance is not working. All of the other links is working. I'm not sure if others are experiencing that, but when I went to try to explore it, I couldn't get to it, just flagging. a question I have, and it's connected to what we've already been getting at a little bit. What's top of mind for me are the students that we know don't have access to digital software and technology. We've all acknowledged that. We know LEAs are working really hard to get that. And it seems to me there's a tension with the legal ramifications of ongoing absence for students, and also this recognition that many of our students don't have the technology to do distance learning. And so is that specified in the guidance, or are we anticipating LEAs will play this by ear? In terms of, like, I guess another way to put it is, how do we anticipate an LEA will judge a student who is absent consecutively for, let's say, plus 10 days versus a student who is not having access to technology, and how do we get in front of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the things that we've heard a lot from schools about right now is their commitment to and ability to reach students over time. I think this is having this policy to collect attendance daily our values of how a school should be reaching and checking and connecting with students every day. And so I think it is a balance about how they do that, and that we think they should be thinking, our proposal is that they be thinking about how to collect that information daily, be that through logging in via a phone or a computer or a tablet or some other way, or via connecting with educators at school. I think that we have had we meaning the education sector, have had lots of conversation with our partners at CFSA to talk about a couple of different things. One, how to ensure that we are making appropriate referrals in times when schools can't reach students. And that is a matter of health and safety as much as anything. And we're thinking about how we do that next year. It's not entirely, there's a, sort of that's the support side. On the quote unquote accountability side, we've also had similar questions about not incentivizing reporting for truancy, which is not the intention in this time. And we've had different kind of conversations about that. Those two things are not directly addressed here because we are not in the position of making regulatory change that articulates those things, but they are commitments on behalf of the education sector. And you should know that those are conversations currently ongoing, which is that the intent of these policies is not to increase truancy, nor to lose connection with students at a time when they may need more of our supports.
Yeah.
So the intent of collecting it every day is to set up systems in which we attempt to reach children every day, both for connection and for education.
Yep. Two quick follow-up questions. Do we know the rate or the latest attendance percentage for the spring when we did our first run of distance learning? And I asked that just anticipating what may come in the fall and beyond, as we're likely going to remain on distance learning. And again, just wanting to think about how do we get in front of the complications that are inevitably going to come. And I appreciate what you're sharing, that our purpose is not to penalize students and families, but also I am wanting to be cautious, and while assuming the best of all LEAs and all educators, not wanting to wait until after the fact to realize that there may have been hotspots or problems that we didn't catch soon enough, and therefore students miss out on education for many months if they are not being appropriately followed up with. And then that second question, so the attendance rate is one. The second question is a very technical, specific question around transportation. I know it seems the transportation from Ward 5 shelters was extended in this year's budget. I know it's still ongoing. For schools that may go between in-person education to distance learning, let's say if there's a new outbreak, is there guidance from OSSI around how transportation services may be provided to support some of our most vulnerable students?
Yeah, two great questions. I would say to the first question is that I think actually the intent of this policy is to do what you're saying, in that we would like to have real-time state level data to track, so that and or the LEAs have that data and can reflect on it. So that if they say, you know, this group of students or these handful of students are not logging in, that they are required to document it every day so that they can reflect on that and have it, and then know whether or not they should be responding and in what way they should be responding. And I know we've had schools talk about how important it is to, and how their own resources are being redevoted to that now, right? And sometimes it's because families have moved, and sometimes it's because of technology access and everything in between. Sometimes it's disengagement. And so we think that by requiring the collection of attendance in a remote and in an in-person posture, it allows schools and us to have the same expectation of the kind of monitoring we should be doing. And therefore doesn't let things slip away, right? Because right now, OSSI has not collected state level daily attendance since the closure. And that was in part because of the nuanced and fluid type of response at the time that we closed. You know, we'll be going back in a couple of weeks. And so therefore it didn't make sense to collect, you know, attendance at the state level when schools were closed, and it was unclear what it would mean and how it would be used. And this is our reflection. You know, that is obviously very different when you're in the immediate urgent response phase than when you're in a planning phase for the whole new year. And so this is our plan to have a thoughtful response going into next school year.
Gotcha, super helpful. And just want to say shout out, I noticed in the plans that you are going to, it looks like by end of June, make public distance learning plans for families. I know that's something we've heard. I'm sure you've heard that as well. So thank you for being responsive to families.
Sure.
And then too, like, I think it's important to sort of think about, and you see a lot of parents' frustration all around the country through memes about distance learning, like chucking the computer out the door. Like, we just fundamentally should be at a different place than we were when this pandemic first happened. Like, the conversation can't just be about, like, yes, devices and getting devices in the hands of families and students is so important. But if we're going to do this and do it well, we've got to start thinking about, well, what happens when the computer breaks down? And how do I support a family in, like, using the technology appropriately? We have, and that's like the power of what we're trying to do with the guiding principles, is because we can't just be stuck in sort of just passing out the resources. We have to also begin thinking about how to use those effectively and efficiently to pushing that needle.
Thank you. Mr. Parker, additional questions? Are you done?
I'm good. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Jacobson.
John Paul, and thank you, Justin and Shauna, for spending so much time and effort on this. The presentation was excellent. I also wanted to thank you, and I hope you will pass my thanks along to the superintendent for following the regular regulatory and emergency regulatory process, and acknowledging the State Board of Education's role in approving changes to attendance, seat time, and graduation requirements. Very much appreciate you doing that. For my newer colleagues, wanted to just raise a caution about emergency regulations. I think this is entirely appropriate this time. If a global pandemic isn't an emergency, I don't know what is. But under past superintendents, not Ms. Kang, but past superintendents, I think the emergency regulatory process have been abused at times, and that doesn't allow the full public to engage and for us to actually be informed when we're voting on an emergency regulation. So this is terrific. Really appreciate it. Very thoughtful, and I do acknowledge this is an emergency and appropriately used at this point in time. So each LEA can use its own LMS, correct? An LEA just selects one. What I'm hearing a lot about is even different, and this is part of the memes, Justin, that you were talking about, even different teachers are using different systems in their classrooms, and that's difficult for teachers, but it's also difficult for students and families. And can you just talk to that for a couple of minutes?
Shauna, do you want to go? Or do you want me to? I think Shauna knows this way more intimately than I do, but we can tag team. So go, Shauna.
As a parent, I would say Yeah, and that's hard. It's hard. As educators, I think there's it's very hard for them as well, in that I don't think most schools or educators themselves plan to be doing school this way. And so they are using what they have, and what in many cases, schools and classrooms did use educational technology to deliver assignments and get feedback and talk to their peers. And in as much as that flexibility was provided to individual schools and teachers, and they were using it effectively during regular school when they were going to school and those expectations were set, that gets magnified a lot more when all of a sudden you are taking the things that worked in a normal time and changing it into an emergency time. I know that many schools are thinking about, so both sides of the issue. One, letting teachers choose what works for them in a way that they think they can most effectively teach their students, which can be different for different ages and grades or different types of classrooms, right? So a math technology and social studies technology might work differently in different types of classrooms, but also the actual real lived experience of the people on the receiving end of those, including parents who in many cases were not exposed to this at all, and their kids were working on their own, and then all of a sudden the parent is now in charge. So I think there's a lot of grace to be given on both sides of the issue. And I know schools are thinking about it as they move forward, balancing those issues and acknowledging it is very challenging. I can empathize with that personally. It's very hard.
And then as crafted, does this regulation give individual teachers or schools that flexibility to use what works for them and what their students are responding to best? Or is it like one size fits all per LEA?
This does not touch the instructional technology at all. This is only saying that an acceptable form of collection of attendance is saying, we saw that the student logged in and sat through X number of hours, or logged into this and submitted the assignment, or whatever the standard is that is setting, and we don't make any comment on what that system is or how it's being used for other things or not used for other things. And so that autonomy is still fully with the LEA to administer. And again, I know that comes with strengths and weaknesses and challenges, but this is only saying, like, here's the standard by which you can be submitted as present if you're not in the building.
And then would that allow an individual LEA to use multiple platforms to provide that data, that confirmation that a student's in a class?
For us, we only care about the big data that's coming through from the LEA to us about the schools. And we don't really care how it gets there, as long as it's accurate and it's submitted in the appropriate format and it follows the school's own policy. So, and that's true now. So, so that doesn't change really. It's just saying that, like, you're allowed to take attendance when somebody isn't going to physically be in the building, because that's the world we're living in now. And we want to make that possible for LEAs to do.
2 more questions. I'll be brief. Does the use of an LMS, to Dr. O'Leary's point, does using an LMS versus in-person touch points with students, does that impact a school's culture? Can it impact the school's culture?
I'm sure it could. I don't know that I have particular speculation on that. I know that schools are doing many different things to reach students, and so we want to enable that to happen, and for schools to be thoughtful about how they are reaching out to their students and students who are in different situations. And so we think it's best that we don't dictate that specifically for any individual LEA, that they make those choices themselves that are in response to their own families and educators and in their own educational contexts.
I also think, Jack, you'll begin to see school, like you will see in the implementation plans that we just finished on, you will see a lot of LEAs being thoughtful about that and maintaining some of their cultural rituals, like if they had a morning meeting, or the way they did announcements, or the way that they did advisory. Like we did see LEAs maintain some of those practices, and still keep some of those elements and hallmarks of what makes their school cultures. So yeah, and you also see people using different mediums too. Like I've seen principals both here and in other places that I've worked, like using Instagram to do their announcements and shout outs to students. So this is a place where where you want flexibility and to be nimble, because if we manage it too tightly, I think we would really constrain people from doing good things.
Perfect. And my last question deals with truancy and check-ins. To what degree is MPD being involved in that versus other forms of interaction with students that might not be meeting the attendance requirements at a given school? This is something that is obviously very high on folks' radar right now, and would love to understand better what that interplay is.
I think obviously the engagement of policing in schools is a big issue and a meaningful issue right now, Jack. I think OSSE does not have influence as to how those relationships happen in schools related to truancy or otherwise. And so truancy is related to how we work with families to come back into the educational system. And there are other ways, in terms of discipline or security or school resource officers that schools use, both contracts with policing or other security. And we don't have, that's not a state matter. That would be happening with the LEA. So
it is, but I just want to make sure that if we're approving this regulation and then to implement the regulation with fidelity, LEAs are using our police force to check on students. We just need to be open about that and make a decision. The stakes are too high right now, and I'm happy to talk offline with anyone, my colleagues, to dig a little deeper into this, because I think it's something that we've gotten just tons and tons of questions on. And with that, I'll yield my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Batchelor?
Thank you. I didn't have any questions. I just wanted to thank you, Justin and Shauna, for joining us tonight. I know we also talked about this at length in our leadership meeting earlier this week, and so did get some of my early questions out, and did want to also thank my colleagues for the thoughtful and in-depth questions we presented today. Some I hadn't thought of, but definitely are top of mind now for me. So just wanted to thank you all for leaning into this conversation and helping us. Also, giving our families a little grace, but also making sure that both our families and our schools are doing what they're supposed to do to make sure our students are showing up and learning. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. President Wattenberg.
Also, thanks to both of you. And just as Jack said, thank you very much for talking to us and going through the process on this. I have a couple of questions, and I'll try to do them very quickly. One is on this engagement issue, and I understand all this is very hard. I can't even in my mind quite understand how it works. But can you imagine an LEA plan on engagement that would be too little? I'm just trying to get a sense of how are we going to know whether students are really going? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, Shauna, do you want me to? I can speak a little bit of how we handled this in the past, right? Like with certain components. So we looked very closely in implementation plans. The superintendent wanted us to look very closely on grading and promotion policies and communicating that with families specifically in the school's implementation plan for last year, right? And if we did not see things in the application that suggested that there was a consistent policy and consistent communication and a direct communication with families about the future of like what grade a student was going to go to, we asked for further clarification and information on that to like get to a place of yes. We also, I'm trying to think of another.
But so this attendance engagement isn't your only index. That's what you're saying.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
okay. That's what I was. Okay,
that's correct. And then too, Ruth, I think it's important on attendance is that the statutes and the regulations require a lot of steps at the school level to intervene early and often in addressing students' attendance even before they're truant. For example, the school, the SSTs, the student, I forget what the acronym stands for. But there are certain interventions, the school monitor, the attendance monitor, and their codified roles in the regulations. There's a lot of supports there to engage families that are already embedded in the current regulation that we contemplate.
And those would kick in on the same kind of schedule as they did before when you had other kinds of attendance.
That's right. We're not changing any of that.
All right. Second, someone had raised the idea, and you sort of hinted at it, I mean, that there are safety and health issues for students that get sometimes handled at schools. And somebody had raised the possibility that on the software or somewhere on the how a student checked in, there might be some information on what to do if they had some safety issue. Is that something that has been discussed or?
So
our schools are discussing a lot about how to, and working with our partners at CFSA to set up new, if not capital P policies and procedures for monitoring student safety and how to do that. I don't think those are necessarily built into attendance policy per se. They're definitely built into the conversations that our schools are having right now with their own teams related to health and wellness and with CFSA related to making sure that we're getting appropriate monitoring or inquiry into student situations that seem potentially unsafe and working on referral processes to do that.
and then Ruth, oh, go ahead, Shauna. Sorry.
No, I was going to defer to Ruth.
Oh, if you go to when you take a look at the principles, you'll see in 2A, like the set of, like, we are setting principles around whole child supports. So really trying to get schools and LEAs to think intentionally about all of the supports that go into like fully educating a child, whether it be mental health, whether it be food, school climate, whether it be bullying, sexual harassment, discipline, all of these, like they are like, that is a part of the guiding principles piece there that we're asking schools to still maintain those commitments and supports even in this time.
And then last question, one comment on high schools. Is there anything that speaks to it? You have to look at every class, or the LEA just comes up with that plan?
We're anticipating, that LEAs will articulate what their
How that would work.
expectations are. Yeah.
All right. And then the one thing I want to say before we end, make sure I have this right, that we all talked about last time, is the way you've got this organized. And per Jack, I mean, I agree this is the way it has to go, given the emergency. There'll be the emergency regs, and then at a certain point, we'll be asked to approve the final regs. And the idea, of course, is that the final regs will look like the emergency regs, correct? I mean, the idea is to have a certain seamlessness.
I mean, that's certainly the intent. I think there is room if there are things that have been missed or other, other technical changes that we will be reproposing them. But
So I just want to make sure everybody understands that sort of this is their moment to raise, not, 6 months from now. But
Yes.
thank you very, very much.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's true. Like we want to. That's why we're here. That's why we're trying to do this on the front, end and together. There's also like when you approve our proposed rule later on, we still have to go through administrative procedure. Like we have to go to notice and comment. We have to follow administrative law, and we can't change regulations that much without doing like another round. So there's rules around that in administrative law that we've got to keep. So yes, Rick, that's the entire sequence. So your feedback up front is super helpful in getting it right the first time, so we don't have to do some of these other changes later.
Well, we're glad to participate. We loved having you. Thank you very much. Any final thoughts from you guys?
And I think just as like things come up, Shauna, like we're more than happy. Like, if you can send us your thoughts through email. If there's something that you didn't understand, you can reach out. You can reach out to me. We're continuing our feedback with our stakeholders now. So it's just like anything that we can do to be supportive, to sort of capture your feedback and think through things. I know that like it's a lot of stuff, and we can answer those questions the best we can.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you.
Okay. So we are substantially off. Just want everybody to know. So if we go late, it's okay with me, but know that that's the case. But maybe we'll go through some of these other ones more quickly. But now we are at number 5, the COVID response and recovery. So the first thing really was to have a discussion about the recommendations that have come out from Reopen. You know, we all participated. We sent in the memo to Reopen. Now there is a set of recommendations. So we wanted to hear any feedback that people have. And then the second is to talk about the special ed issue under COVID and follow up on that. So with that, let me open it up to anyone who wants to comment on the Reopen recommendations.
So Ruth, this is John Paul. As we're getting started on this conversation, I do want to also note that I've continued to be part of those conversations with the Deputy Mayor's office, which were daily calls and then every 3-day calls, and now they are once-a-week calls as we're moving forward with things. One of the things to look forward is there is now a thought that if things continue the way that they are, the likelihood is that the district may be ready for the phase 2 of reopening by about June 21st, which is soon. However, that also then requires that there's no increases in community transmission and no increases in other things. So it is very possible that that will be delayed, but that is probably the earliest possible date that we may move into phase 2. Marcus, you're on mute.
There we go. I just wanted to say from an administrative standpoint that we've also been thinking on an ongoing basis about what this means, what the reopening plan means for the state board's operations. And clearly, as we begin getting closer to the beginning of the school year, I've expressed to John Paul and Ruth, while like our physical operations inside the office will likely have to be curtailed for a long time, or at least for a little longer. I'm also interested in making sure that the board demonstrates, right, our commitment to continuing our work just like we expect our families to, i.e., right, if we're going to send our young people into the classroom at the at the beginning of the school year, then when do we think about resuming at least partially in-person meetings or some type of in-person operation to serve our families? So we're thinking about that, and we'll continue to update everybody as the situation evolves and changes. But just wanted to let you know that we're keeping that at the top of mind.
Dr. O'Leary, I think you have a question.
Yes, no, I don't have a question. I just have a comment that the fact that we were left out of the reopen process completely it boggles the mind. And if we have another spike, I would like to publicly ask that the State Board of Education is on the education committee, since we do have something to do with education in the city.
Thank you. Dr. Sutter, is your hands up from the last time or this time? Okay. Mr. Jacobson, I think you had a question?
Or can I just be clear? This is also comments.
Yeah.
What's going on?
And Fraser, you and I talked last week about the week before about the Reopen Committee and our lack of representation on that. And I'd like to talk to you more about that offline, because I think what I heard last week was different than what you said tonight.
Ruth, did you have additional comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to raise something very general, which is I was on a call last night with our Ward 3 EdNet group, or whatever night, Monday night. And there was a lot of discussion, and you may be hearing it in your wards, about this idea of moving a lot of education outside. That one of the things that is increasingly clear is that if you're outside and open ventilation, the transmission is a lot less. And so these people are proposing, hey, we can use our parking lots. We should we should shut down our streets. And as she put it, I thought it was a great line. The first people say is, oh, but what about the weather? And she goes, there's no bad weather, just bad gear. And, she has this idea of you could have tents and you can have all kinds of stuff. Anyway, I just wonder if others people were fairly impressed with the idea. I won't say nobody had a problem with it. And then I posed it to some parents, and parents were interested. So my question really is, has anybody else been hearing this? Do you think there's interest in it?
I have, Ruth, at the last Ward 1 Ed Council meeting, it came up and it was one of the more robust conversations. And mainly because there were parents who who had been doing research on it, and they see that other, mostly private schools, honestly, are doing it. And then there was pushback because there's concern that there are a lot of schools that don't have space. But I think, the point that you make, and I was going to raise this too, is just, can we come up with, it seems like it's the time to sort of think outside of the box about space, right? And how we use it. And could we repurpose some outdoor space specifically for schools that don't have it? I don't know. So I'll also say some of the pushback was also from school leaders and teachers who just felt like it would be they couldn't picture how they could manage that, right? Like it seemed like one more thing that they had to wrap their minds around planning and managing. And so they were not excited about it, to be honest. But it definitely was it was a topic that seemed like it needed more time, and there was definitely interest in having that conversation. So, I was also thinking, I wonder if museums could help out at this point, if they could make space for schools, and there could be spaces where students are learning that are not in school buildings so that more kids can go back.
Thank you. Dr. Sutter?
Thanks. So I think I'm the only one here who taught in Southern California. As someone who taught in Southern California where the weather is good most often, I did teach outside when we were in a first-year charter school in the basement of the Boys and Girls Club. And we lost our classrooms every day at noon. So all my reading groups were outside in the afternoons, as was a number of sort of small group remediations. In a very small school setting, it worked really well. We had 90 kids. It was totally doable. When we had 180 kids, it was a lot harder. And I'm not exactly sure how it would work in settings of 300 kids or more. But it's an intriguing idea. I think some things I would wonder about. The Hill also has a number of schools with very limited outdoor space. I think of Brent Elementary, which has next to no outdoor space and certainly couldn't fit all of its kids out there, or even half of its kids out there. But, I think in line with the comment that I wanted to make, there's two things that I'm hearing from families that I think are missing from the Reopen DC recommendations. One is childcare as a leading indicator here. So we have a lot of teachers who have children of their own. And if different school systems are doing different things, and we have teachers living in Montgomery, Prince George's, Howard counties, Northern Virginia, we're going to be dealing with a complicated equation, especially if childcare has not reopened. So I think one thing that seems to be missing from conversations in DC is sequencing, with childcare needing to really reopen first in order for us to have the most robust workforce possible, and to reopen first across the jurisdictions. The second thing is, and I struggle with this myself, we're thinking in a paradigm of what exists and what we know and regulations we have to contend with. And I think, to Emily's point, the notion of like using museums or There's a ton of offices that no one's going back to because they can work from home. How are we thinking about the multitude of learning spaces available? And how are we thinking about the tension that exists between wanting to have some common set of expectations as a state, but also recognizing that if we allow different LEAs to do things differently, we also have a series of natural experiments that can give us multiple models, some that work better and some that work less well. I talked to one LEA who's having internal discussions about the idea of having elementary school students come in, and middle and high schoolers at the upper levels stay home, so that they can use the maximum number of facilities within their LEA to spread out and have all elementary schoolers come back all the time, spread out across many more facility spaces. And while that poses certain challenges, there's a logic to it. I can't imagine DCPS could do that at scale, but it would be interesting to see some smaller LEAs model that out and let us know. Because I do hope that Dr. Fauci is right and we have a vaccine by this winter. But in case we don't, I think we have a lot of opportunities to learn. So that's my thinking. Just my comments are, I worry that our reopen recommendations are living within a paradigm of what exists. And I don't think we've thought about sequencing childcare for the workforce before our schooling.
Ms. McClay.
So I just listed one of my comments on this topic on the chat, but thinking about, I'm all for innovation. I love the fact that people are thinking about what can we do to make sure that students are getting classroom time, seeing friends, being able to have that in-person instruction. However, when you look at it, and Ward 3 is vastly different than Ward 7 and 8, but even that remains. There are challenges with low-income students in Ward 3 who don't have rain boots or rain clothes when it's raining and you're outside, don't have jackets, can't even get the proper uniforms. When we're currently dealing with schools who can't get the necessary computers to have digital learning, how would we go about getting tents, fans, and all the other resources needed to have outdoor education? Those, well, in theory, it sounds like a great, possibility to do for a certain limited amount of time. It's not really a viable solution, especially not for the long term. What if we have a cold snap? What if, and not to mention for kids who can't deal with the heat, we can't have school when air conditioners are out. So how are we going to have school when it's September 15th and it's still 90 degrees outside? Those are all things that you have to think about that probably, and for multiple different schools and across the city. But again, I am very, very excited about the use of innovation and getting in-person instruction as we can. The other thing I wanted schools to think about, because Jessica had a point about some schools bringing back certain grade levels at a time, but not necessarily their entire school force. That is being done in other states, and actually my boss is dealing with it in another country. You have to look at parents who have students that are in multiple grade levels, and while some are still at home, others are going back to school. How do parents deal with that? That is a huge problem that that parents are going to have to face if that becomes the reality. And is that realistic to require some parents to drop a student off while having other students back at school who may be dealing with school class time all at the same time? That's something I really don't see as being a viable solution. So just a couple comments when you look at those ideas. Thanks, guys.
Mr. Parker.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I share in concerns about having school outside. Although I don't think it's a horrible idea, I just don't think it's a long-term solution for our students. A few things that came to mind looking at the recommendations, it seems as though there's a hybrid approach that's recommended where students continue distance learning and that a smaller group of students enter school buildings if possible. And I just want to underscore that while I know parents are having a really difficult time, I cannot imagine, but I empathize with parents. I just want to caution DC from sending students in harm's way, as well as putting teachers in harm's way. And so, even if there are only 10 students to a classroom, that's still putting the adults, some of whom may be elderly, at risk. And so if we are investing time and guidance, and I'm sorry, my dog is making a lot of noise in the background if you're hearing that chewing noise. If we're investing time and energy in building out guidance and infrastructure and technology capabilities, my recommendation would just be, or feedback would be for us to double down on ensuring there's consistency there versus going back and forth, maybe having a spike, therefore having to double back and go full distance learning mode, et cetera. So that's one thing. If the district does go forward with this hybrid approach, a question I have, and John Paul, I'm not sure if you have insight here, is for those students who would be permitted to go into school buildings, let's say 10 to a classroom, are there prescriptions of which students that might be? Special needs, at-risk students, et cetera? That is a thought. Obviously, my recommendation would be to ensure that our most vulnerable students get as much in-person time as possible. And the only other wondering I have, and partly feedback, would be to connect unemployment resources with those families who are still needing to be at home because students are on distance learning. I would imagine that may have already come up, I don't know. But I would imagine as businesses are coming back online, there may be a tension in which families are afforded unemployment, while some of those same families, while they may technically be able to go back to work, may not be able to do so because of their child having to be on distance learning. So those are just some of my initial thoughts. Last thing I would say, and because I haven't had a chance to deeply internalize OSSI's guidance because I wasn't able to see it, but I do have it, so thank you for sharing it. It's just wondering what guidance recommendations we're providing to LEAs, not the state board. I know we don't deal with curriculum, but in terms of learning, thinking both technical and adaptive, it seems like many of these recommendations are overly technical, which makes sense, bringing schools back online. But I would encourage us to think about what is the state and the mode of learning when schools are back online. And to that point, our emphasis on grade level instruction, how do we provide guidance and recommendations to schools to double down on grade level instruction and weaving in remedial skills and knowledge versus what might be a tempting move for some, which is to go back and redo the previous school year all over, which would put some of our most disadvantaged students at a further disadvantage. So I would just want some of those adaptive, more knowledge and instructional recommendations also included here. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. I do want to also note to Zachary, to your point about the ranking for back to school time, the DC Schools Family Engagement Survey that the DME put out and that we have been plugging and a number of other people are plugging does have that. It does have it gets to that ranking. That survey actually does close tonight at 10 p.m. So for our viewing public that is watching, you still have time to fill out that survey. And you can find the link to it at our Twitter or on other Twitters as well. But use ours because it's better. Mr. O'Sullivan.
I think. Can you guys hear me? All right. So one of the things that I'm going to be looking at, or I guess what I'll be presenting to you next week, is our Student Advisory Committee report. And one of the 3 things we covered was like distance learning, but also like how school will work next year. And as like the Student Advisory Committee, which is made up of like 20 students or so, we all collectively basically agreed that before anything is finalized, before really any plan becomes solidified and is actually put in effect, a couple things need to happen. One, I think students directly need to be in that process because I don't think you can start school without directly gauging how students feel and if they're comfortable going back in any sort of modified way of schooling in person. And I also think that we need to prioritize student safety and teacher safety above all else because in a worst case scenario, if even one student or teacher dies because they got infected or there was a student that was infected that came to school, that would be a horrible situation. And I don't think we'd want to put anyone in that particular situation. And I also think that one of the things that we covered was talking about sort of like the way, and this kind of goes back earlier to what Aussie was presenting, this thing about like whatever's happening with distance learning through whatever platform. Something that's important is that there's one platform being used because there can be confusion, but also there needs to be effective communication with students, families, whoever, about what's happening. And this needs to be, I think, a process that's like held continuous throughout the summer because I think that it's important that like come August like 20th, it's not like, oh, we're doing what? Like, and a bunch of families have questions. I think this needs to be a process that students have, that that students are incorporated in. And I think families need to be heard. And I think before any of these like creative solutions people are talking about, before we look into that further, I also think it's important that the city, whoever is coming up with some of the plans, like one of them was looking at like maybe a select group of students go to school for 1 week, then everyone else stays home, and there's sort of like a cycle of that happening. We need to look at how students are going to be safe inside and outside the classroom from contracting the virus, and that includes transportation. Like, I don't know, like I personally, a number of students, don't see how it's possible to prevent students from contracting the virus riding public transportation. And if students can't ride public transportation, unless there's some other option that's in place that's free for all students and that doesn't rely on parents taking them to school, there's no way like it can work. There's no way reopening schools can work. And I just think there needs to be a detailed plan that comes from the mayor, that comes from Aussie, whoever's in charge of this particular situation. We, as Zachary is saying, we need to be overly cautious here, and we need to actually realize that no matter what happens, if someone were to die from the virus,
I think we may have lost Alex's feed, but hopefully he'll be back here in a second. In order to keep going on time, I believe everyone has, oh, Alex, are you back?
yeah.
Okay, go ahead, sorry.
I just want to say, it's just important students' concerns are heard and that we play it safe here. And with whatever happens, there needs to be a detailed list of steps that exactly shows how students will be safe from the virus, and teachers as well.
Thank you. I believe now everyone has had a first, oh, Jack, sorry. Jack has not had a first round. Go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Ruth and Marcus, for allowing some conversation around our response to COVID. I think we've been too silent on this, and really appreciate you making space and room here to have a discussion of all the challenges that our students and our teachers and our support staff are facing. My questions sort of tend to gravitate around staffing issues. One, I think Alex's supposition that if group A goes 1 week and group B goes another week, you can sort of figure out a way to social distance, and if someone does become positive, that we could, who the peers were. But I think you're going to need a lot more janitorial staff at all of these schools once we're even close to reopening. I know that our office building even right now has already increased janitorial services. And I would assume the same is going to be necessary for schools, and want to make sure that that's just taken into account. They're not free. All of this costs money. And then I think we also need to think about the need for increased number of teachers to accommodate social distancing. If a classroom to be social distancing can only accommodate 15 students rather than 25, that means you need 2 classrooms and you probably need 2 teachers then. And so to what extent do we want to suggest that waiving teacher certification so that we have more adults to service the same number of students might be appropriate or might not? I think that's a conversation that we really need to think about, because we want quality teachers, but at the same time, the same teacher can only do so much, and there's already so much being heaped on these teachers with having to juggle multiple classes over multiple platforms, and also learn how to do distance learning. I think that's something that we're really going to need to struggle with. And then I thought it was kind of an interesting supposition that Ruth put forward at the beginning of the discussion about outdoor learning, or perhaps learning in museums, or I think Zachary might have said museums or other spaces that are large enough to accommodate classroom sizes. A couple of logistical problems there. Ward 2 has a ton of libraries and museums and everything. So my students are super fortunate in that, if that's the direction we go. I think some other wards may not have as many of those options. And then when you go to outdoor space or larger auditorium space to keep social distancing rules, what about those that are visually impaired or have auditory problems? How do we make sure that they are still fully able to participate in a classroom experience? And all of these are really tough questions that we are going to need to struggle with. And to Ruth's point, these are questions that need to be raised with the public if we're looking at putting children back in potentially vulnerable positions along with their teachers and support staff. So with that, that's all I have to offer right now. Thanks.
Yeah, I will note to Jack's point. I mean, one of the things that we as an agency are being told related to potentially coming back in the fall or coming back at some point is that the district government will cover the purchase of masks and PPE for employees that are coming back, and that won't come out of the agency's budget. It will come out of some other budget from somewhere else. And so I don't know where that's coming from, but the assumption that I'm making is that it will come from federal emergency funds, which is fine, but that's not going to last forever either. And we need to figure out if this is going to be something that we only have access to for a certain amount of time. Like how are we going to do that as an agency is one of the things that Serena, Dan, and I are talking about for our offices. But it's the same thing that's happening in schools, right? We have to make sure, to Jack's point, the janitorial staff, they need to have access to the types of training and cleaning that are effective for this type of virus, right? It's not just mopping the floor. Right? It's not just the normal types of things. You have to have a certain level of understanding of what is actually needed to provide the type of cleanliness that is effective in a pandemic situation. And I think that's another thing that's interesting to talk about as well. Okay, so just to make sure that I'm getting everybody, I think everyone has had a first round. Ruth, do you want to have a second round, or do you want to go ahead and move on to the next thing and have everyone who has additional questions to email them to me, and I will do my best to compile them and bring that information, that question, back to the DME and others. Ruth, you're on mute.
Well, I want to put one thing out there. Actually, let me call in Zach, because he'd raised this and some of us talked about it, to talk about the town hall idea.
Yes.
Sorry, I mean, I'm like you can read my mind, but sorry.
Yes, very quickly. I know we're over time. John Paul sent over the resolution summarizing what we called for sent over the resolution to OSSI, summarizing what we called for in the resolution related to resources, services, and amendments to guidance for students with disabilities. And one of those recommendations included having some type of town hall, conversation, YouTube Live. I don't think the specifics there are as important as the idea of having a conversation with the broader public to both solicit feedback, but also to hear from parents, community members, advocates around the state of learning the spring and what recommendations may provide for the fall as we move forward in distance learning. In full transparency, we haven't heard back from OSSI on that. We only sent it this week, so that's not a shame and blame moment. But just saying, just given the time when we sent that summary, we haven't yet heard back. So my recommendation would be for us to give them some more time to respond, to see, because ideally we would want to do this alongside OSSI in true partnership, to hear from the community at large. Ideally, this would be a board conversation where we would all be there and we would get our constituents to lean in as they would want to. So that we can gain more information to either provide further guidance and resolutions to OSSI and or so that we can be more equipped and prepared for learning in the fall. So Ruth, I don't know if we want to open it up now for just initial reactions, but this is less a vote. This is a more just putting it out there that that's where we are as a point of information.
So before Ruth, I do want to also bring up, so there was the monthly meeting with OSSI earlier this week, and this is one of the things that we did discuss during that meeting. So I do want to note too that OSSI did say in that meeting that they hadn't had a chance to look at any of the information, partially because their budget hearing was also last week, and it's kind of crunch time for a lot of folks to get focused on just the budget for that period. But I do want to note as well, in their credit, that OSSI has over the past number of years really focused a lot on special education and has done some good things. I think we need to applaud while also asking these good questions, which is appropriate. And I think too that some of the recommendations are in line with some of the following conversations that we're going to have related to STAR framework and for that related to the school report card as well. So.
The only thing I would say is Zach had raised this, and then John Paul and Marcus and I talked about it in our leadership meeting, is that part of the idea would be, which is a little different than what we've done in the lunchtime live so far, is the point really would be to hear from people. That would really be the ideas. It's more like the hearings that we've had, which I don't think we've had lately, where we just invited, anybody come, anybody talk, tell us what's going on, so that it becomes, it's a way of inserting those voices into the conversation. And so I agree. I mean, so that's sort of a thought. And if people want to say something. You can email, any of us. And if you think it's a great idea or a horrible idea or something in between, or have a way of framing it.
Can we talk about it next week?
Yep, I was going to say, for the sake of time, I would ask that you just follow up with Ruth and me offline, and Ruth, let's just keep the conversation going if that's okay. Just appreciating that we're way over schedule.
Okay. Okay. Oh, am I calling it? Okay. So the next is the resolution on Black African American teachers. I don't know who's bringing that up, Jessica or Alex.
I leave it, Mr. O'Sullivan. What do you think? You want me to say a few words and I'll let you chime in?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So, Alex and I have been working together on a resolution in support of Black African American educators. This came out of conversations around the resolution on Latino educators and the fact that there was disproportionality between students and teachers brought up in that resolution. I had raised some questions during discussion of that resolution about how we were supporting other educators of color, specifically African American Black educators in DC, given the large proportion of students in the district who are Black or African American, and the disproportionality between them and their teachers. So Alex reached out and said he was interested in this as well, and he and I teamed up to draft the document that you received. This is still very much a draft, because the other thing that happened that I'll let Alex expound upon is that Dr. Simmons, who'd come to speak to us at our meeting, is interested in this work as well. He made some suggestions about others, Sharif El-Mekki, who runs the Center for Black Educator Development. And so Alex and I reached out to those folks so that we could also get information from experts working in this field already about how we might craft a resolution. We also relied on some research that's been out recently from the Ed Trust, from Urban Teachers, and from the Digital Promise organization, which just put a great review of literature on teachers of color and what the research in America says right now about the state of the number of educators of color, issues with recruitment, retention, and support for educators of color, including Black educators across America. So the draft before you comes from that. I'm going to turn it over to Alex for a much more in the real world experience of this, and other thoughts you may want to add.
Thanks, Jessica. So like she said, kind of what we were focusing on are like two main things, of like improving recruitment and retention for Black teachers. And I think this resolution on doing that couldn't be any more relevant to what's happening today and what's being reflected in the protests in the street right now. Because as a nation, we're not just protesting police brutality, we're protesting the racial injustice that exists and the systemic racism that has afflicted Black people for generations since 1619. And schools have those same issues too. Our public school systems, in my opinion, are failing our Black and brown students. And while one Black teacher can't magically solve that problem, having one Black teacher has a dramatic effect, a positive effect for Black students. They increase their chances of graduating high school and attending college. And I think that like that's not necessarily enough either, because one of the things that Jessica sent to me yesterday, an article I read, talked about how we want to have a school system that works for all students. Then we can't just rely on one Black teacher shouldering the social justice load. A multicultural, diverse teacher work field must exist if we want to create an inclusive space for Black students where they can feel appreciated and cared for and safe. And I think that like if we really want to make a difference, and I think like I know members of the board have stated like their direct goals of like creating anti-racist policy and demonstrating that Black Lives Matter. And I think it's time that we as a board also look at how Black lives are being affected in the classroom in particular. And I think that schools have a direct impact on the trajectory of a student's life. And too many schools are contributing to the school to prison pipeline that's existing. And I think we need to do something about it. And I think a resolution on really advocating for more Black teachers would be tremendous work, and hopefully we can improve that as a city. I know other cities have done it well, and we're trying to get in contact with people who have done it successfully, who have improved recruitment and retention. And I think that's something that if we can successfully do, it will really create a better world for Black students and Black families, and overall will improve our school system.
As usual, Mr. O'Sullivan is the most eloquent of our bunch. So thank you, Alex, for all of that important context. Two things I'll say is the document is set up using the research and reports that I mentioned to create the whereas statements. in addition, we use the OSSE teacher data report to get the percentages for the district. So that's where we pulled in the information there. For the resolution clauses, we talked about a couple of different ways we thought OSSE and or the mayor's office could take specific action based on the recommendations offered in the Ed Trust report, in the review of literature from the Digital Promise, in several other pieces of research that specifically talk about what kind of things cities have done to increase their retention of educators of color, to increase their ability to recruit. There's a great program in Boston that works to actually work with high school students, setting them up as potential educators, offering scholarships for them pursuing an education degree, and then returning to their schools in Boston to teach. So we talked about grow your own programs in there. And so we borrowed those ideas. We are very open and excited to get comments on this, including sort of line item suggestions, additional data or reports you may want to point us to, as well as any additional ideas you have about how we might enhance the therefore be it resolved sections. And I know, given both global pandemic and massive national racial reckoning, the folks we wanted to talk with and connect with have not been super fast to respond. So we're hoping to connect with them over the next week as well. But entertaining questions now, thoughts, ideas folks have. Dr. O'Leary?
When I started teaching 50 years ago, I was one of the few white teachers in the area of Northwest that I taught in. If you go into the schools now, the racial population has changed dramatically with many, many more white teachers than there used to be. In a lot of the schools, the high schools especially, there may be over 50% of the teachers being white teachers. Now that started with Michelle Rhee. It's been almost 15 years ago. And I don't know if there's a direct relationship between that, but the recruitment that both you and Alex were talking about, Jessica, is the key. Because if you look back on their teacher retention numbers in the last 10 years and look at it racially, it'll blow your mind. That's all I have to say.
I appreciate that, Dr. O'Leary. I think Empower Ed had posted some data this week from a Shanker Institute report that dates from 2012 that showed significant drops in the percentage of the teacher workforce in DC that was African American between 2000, I think it was 3 and 12. And so that fits in that time period that you're talking about. Might have been 2003 to 2011. So I think that's absolutely part of it. The other thing that floored me in the Digital Promise research was that only 7% of all undergraduates nationwide receiving an undergraduate degree in education are Black. And they talk about why. They talk about the notions of student debt. And if you expect that you're going to have a significant amount of university student debt to pay off, you need to contemplate a field to go into that makes enough salary to pay off that debt. So that's part of it. The other thing is that everything Alex is talking about experiences students have in schools, if Black students have less than excellent experiences with their own teachers in schools, if they feel like school is a place where they are over-policed or undervalued, the desire to go back and become part of that system may not be as high. So thinking about how we change our system in all the ways at once is complex, but I think a challenge all of us seem up for. Other thoughts, questions?
Yeah, no, sorry. I applaud this resolution. I think it's timely for all of the reasons that's already been stated, so no need to repeat that. I will just say that this is, I think there is an appetite in the mayor's office for this conversation. Marcus and I were just having a conversation with Deputy Mayor Kine, And this is very much on his radar. In fact, he is interested in exploring what resources are available and the like. So I think this resolution is timely in that respect. Two things I would just call out. One, I would recommend that we include for our own internal work that we engage in further research on teacher retention in specifically connection to Black and African American teachers in the district. And I think there's ways to explore how that might play out. And then the second, to Dr. O'Leary's reflection around, and your point, Dr. Sutter, around like the precipitous drop in Black teachers in the district, I think that coincides, not coincidentally, to the precipitous decline in Black folk in general in DC. And there might be something to both trying to conduct some level of research there broader, maybe not via the state board, but somewhere, to see what are the connections that may have led to the exodus of Black teachers in our schools. Is that a school factor, or are those more external factors? And then I would just say, I don't know this, and maybe I shouldn't say this publicly, but as much as it's possible to collect data, and if this is already on the report card, my apologies, but making connection for where our Black teachers are in terms of their assignments in schools. Like, are we seeing that more Black teachers are going to schools where there are higher turnover rates, or where there is a greater accountability focus, if we will? And so I don't know if that is a matter of just reporting out numbers of African-American teachers at a given school, or again, connecting that to research. I'm happy to think offline around the language there, but those are just some initial thoughts and reactions. And I would just end by saying thank you for putting this forward. I think on the board, there's been an appetite to delve more deeply than the general topic of teacher retention, and I think this is a great opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Dr. Gasol?
Thank you. And I just echo the appreciation for you doing this. I definitely didn't want the Latino teacher resolution to be sort of have a narrowing effect. So this was part of what I was hoping. And I guess, so one question I have is, there has been some talk about housing being like, giving subsidized housing, that kind of thing, to teachers. Is that something that has come up at all in research that you've done as a incentive for teachers? And it seems like maybe there could be some differentiation, and maybe that would be worth looking into. And then just related to the process that I went through, one of the things that was really helpful, and I was just wondering if you have done this, is talking to teachers. Have you had conversations with African American teachers to sort of learn what their main challenges are in our system in particular? Yeah.
It's a great question, Emily. So one thing I know is true is that Empower Ed has a number of folks signed up to give public testimony at our meeting in support of the resolution. So I'm sure we will hear more. But that is also the purpose, I think, of Alex connecting with some of the folks that we reached out to, and some of the reading that we did from the Center for Black Educator Development, et cetera, because that is specifically their target audience. That is the entire population of teachers they work with. They're based in Philadelphia, but they work with teachers across the country. Specifically on this focus. So we gather the research from there. On your point about housing, it's interesting. Some of the national reports do talk about it, and yet the research that the state board conducted in the teacher survey, it does not appear that housing or cost of living is a specific factor leading to turnover in the district. Whether that's different for different demographics, I don't know. Our research didn't get into that. Like, our survey research isn't broken down findings by race or gender, age, et cetera. So I think there's still a reasonable question, but it doesn't seem to be a factor as much in people talking about leaving. Ruth?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I keep not taking my hand down. So then when I put my hand up, nobody knows my hand's up. So
Oh,
anyway.
and I can't see the hands, and I totally stole John Paul's job in calling at people.
Well, thank you. One quick thing to you, and Alex can get in on this. I believe there are cross tabs to the data that we have in the new teacher retention report, and you could actually look. That said, I think there are also there are different populations, right? If you might decide not to move here because of the housing, but that doesn't mean that's the reason why you might leave. So I would just say that. But one question slightly related, in the last bullet, it talks about providing relocation incentives. And I did wonder about that as a place to put the money as opposed to more grow your own and doing it locally. So I just throw that out there.
Alex, I've monopolized this, so I'm going to be quiet for a second. If you've got thoughts or questions, you want to air on that.
Sure. Just to get back to Zachary's point first, I think one of the things that Dr. Simmons was talking about, which is like directly gets back at your question, which is oftentimes like Black teachers are placed directly into the schools that are like graded as low achieving, and in a sense, like, which is kind of what I was saying, which is like all of a sudden Black teachers have to play like the token like Black adult in the room role, where they have to take all the responsibility of like taking after all the Black students. And that's not going to be like a positive experience for a lot of Black teachers, where they feel like they're the ones who maybe they're in a primarily like white teacher workforce, and there are a couple Black teachers, and all of a sudden they have to be the ones who have the burden placed upon them of like accounting for Black students feeling like safe and encouraged and comfortable in the classroom. And then also your point, Emily and Ruth, about sort of incentives. One of the things that I was working on for DC YMCA's Youth in Government, which got canceled towards the end of last year though, which was like creating a bill that would like allow for teachers specifically to ride the Metro 3. I think that there are a bunch of incentives, like creative ideas that we could explore, the city could explore to better improve the recruitment process, and whether that also means something to do with housing or just different incentives that would work that may make like maybe a young college graduate coming back to the city or hearing about some program in like DC, where all of a sudden it may be more forgiving on them if they have like student loans to pay back, where they have incentives where they can teach for maybe a couple years, or maybe they enjoy the role so much they can teach for longer. But I think we should definitely look at different creative solutions that would allow for teachers to teach, but also be rewarded with incentives.
Thank you, Alex. Ms. McClay? Ashley, can you hear me? I called.
Oh, there we go. So along the lines of incentives, I know there have been ideas in the past for teachers to have increased incentives and or increased stipends to, no matter your race, to teach in low achieving schools. Have you guys done any research into any other states that are doing incentive programs to have specifically African American teachers teaching in low achieving schools and to keep them there? Because I know that is something not just for African American teachers, but all teachers, we have high turnover. And I'm just thinking if there's any other research of other schools or states that are doing that.
It's a good question. I will say this, and I should I'll put it in the chat after I say this, but this digital promise report is really fascinating, and they actually talk about a variety of programs that are doing efforts at retaining teachers of color, specifically because that's the focus of this literature review. But one thing they note is that it is typical that teachers of color end up in schools that are low performing. And that I think one of the realities is that when they are in that school, the stress and burden of any teacher teaching in a school that is low achieving is high. And if there aren't specific supports put in place for teachers in those schools, they are the most likely to burn out. And then specifically for Black educators, the research shows that they are often, to points that both Zachary and Alex made, put in disciplinarian roles, which then also puts them in an additional sort of risk of burnout. So there's some really interesting research in there. And I think it's one of those tricky double-edged swords where there seem to be really good reasons for it and also really potential problematic results.
Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, it's a good question. Other questions or thoughts? So
I just wanted to say, I just wanted to thank you and Alex for your work on this. I know we said that this was an important topic that the board wanted to get on and make our voice heard on as quickly as possible. And so I wanted to say that I appreciate the work around that. And I know I put in the chat that, like, I think examining the high level of teacher attrition, Black teacher attrition in our city over the last decade is a really important window to look through as we're assessing, right, what incentivizes recruiting more Black educators and keeping them here in the system. And so definitely just want to raise up that point, because I think it's really important that, when I went to school in this city, I don't think, and obviously, right, this is a virtue of a lot of things, but right, Black teachers had a very strong influence on me, and I didn't have a teacher that wasn't Black until I was in 4th grade, right? And thinking about how that's very different for Black students, right, in our city now, is something like, that we've got to examine. We know that Black educators make a difference in our classroom, and so I just appreciate us really leaning into this conversation, and just again wanted to thank you all for your work.
Dr. Gasoy?
Hi, just two things really quick. First, I'm just thinking ahead, and I'm thinking that, we should think about how we want to push these resolutions forward, like how we want to use them for advocacy. And I think my opinion is we should do it together, that they go together, right? All three of them, actually, the teacher retention and this one and the Latino one. I also just want to clarify something. I felt like maybe my comment came out a little passive aggressive about talking with teachers. And I just want to clarify that. Okay, good. Because the first draft that I did not really include feedback from actual teachers. It was really based on, what the organizations were saying. I mean, granted, they are made up of teachers, but still, and what reports I had read. But when I started talking with actual teachers, that's when I got to the points that really differentiated specific needs for that group. You know what I mean? And it just really drove it home for me that you can't just lump all minority or underrepresented groups together, right? And
Yeah.
so that's why I'm saying it. I just definitely didn't want you to feel like I was, I don't know.
No, I appreciate the feedback. I think it's good feedback. Alex, do you have other questions or folks you want to hear from?
I just want to quickly respond to what Emily said, especially on the point about I think for one, for getting in contact with teachers, particularly Black teachers, may be kind of difficult right now just because everything that's going on. But then what was the other point you made? I just forgot.
About pushing this forward, you mean?
Yeah, I think it would work great for us if we could advocate all three of those resolutions at the same time, because it's not just about having Black teachers, it's also about having a diverse work field of teachers, that there are Latinx teachers, there are Black teachers, white teachers, Asian teachers, so that we can really have a diverse experience and so that all students can be included, but also because there has been data that's shown that there can be a positive impact of having different teachers from different backgrounds, and just overall having different experiences is good. And also it allows for that sort of like for Black students of color feeling comfortable in the classroom. We can have like different races represented, because our public school system is made up of students that are vastly diverse. If our teacher workforce also reflects that, that can allow for a culture that that's really inclusive, and that's a positive nurturing role for young people.
I couldn't have said it better. John Paul, the one thing I would ask of the members and of anyone who has feedback for us, that if you would send us your thoughts in writing on line items, et cetera, that you'd like to see additions or changes. I did take notes on everything that folks put in the chat and folks shared aloud. But if you have specific line items, if you would get them to us by Friday, midday, let's say noon, then I think I would happily commit to turning around those edits so that John Paul can put it into the materials for next week's meeting. And then we can take any other amendments, obviously, in the meeting as we've done with other resolutions. But if you've got anything you'd like us to incorporate, and we'll also commit to continuing any outreach or work to find more details that folks asked for between now and then. Thanks so much.
Zachary, for the equity statement and framework.
Yes, I am chatting it out for those who may not have it already pulled up. A quick frame here. As you know, we've been discussing our equity statement for the last, 2 months now. And so tonight is an opportunity for us to review and discuss a revised statement based on feedback that was received, as well as a proposed equity framework that I'm putting forward based on our equity statement, as well as feedback received to hopefully guide the board's future work. A few things I would highlight is in the document that was just chatted out and included in our preview documents, is that you will notice that there is a multi-year equity vision called out. All of this is up for debate. None of this is set in stone. The idea here is to put forth a vision for how we can make equity something that is living and actionable for us all versus something that just lives on our website. Second thing I would point out is that an equity statement is not something new for the state board here in DC or state boards across the country. Per my research, it seemed all state boards had some type of equity statement or equity focus, some more explicit and detailed than others. And so this is in line with our ongoing focus and emphasis on equity. But I would also just stress that this is also timely given the climate in DC, but also the country, as many are decrying racial inequities of all kinds, in particular in relation to Black students. And while this statement is not centered only on Black students, I just find that this is a timely time, an opportunity for us to focus on our equity statement. And the last thing I would highlight is that you will see on pages 2 and 3 an equity framework. And I'm going to talk about these bit by bit. But the point here is that this is going to be a framework that is built out by all of us through feedback cycles with your constituents that you would bring back to our next conversations, and that we're going to build this together. By no means do I want this to be something that Zach proposed and is doing, not that that's how you're looking at it, but I want us all to be able to own this and stand proud to say we as a board are putting forth a bold vision for how we're going to advance equity in the years to come. I'm going to just quickly frame each of these, and then I'm going to open it up for a brief discussion as we move forward. So as I mentioned, on page 1 at the top, you'll see in red where it's highlighted proposed multi-year vision, equity vision. You'll see three things called out. First of which is the equity statement and framework in 2020. That is what we're reviewing in part tonight. As I already said, we've been discussing this for the past few months, and our previous equity statement came out of the ESSA Equity Committee's work, and so thanks are due to those members as well as constituents for their work in building out the foundation from which we're building from. The idea is that after we engage in this initial work around our equity statement and framework, next year, there would be ongoing work towards identifying equity gaps that exist within our DC landscape. And by equity gaps, those things that we as a state board anticipate as well as have identified are contributing to equity gaps within DC schools. And so, for example, high teacher turnover, which we've been doing a lot of work around, would be one area that we might identify as an equity gap. The hope there is that we can identify anywhere from 5 to 7 equity gaps that we as a board are zeroing in on, that we might propose solutions and identify root causes. And then lastly, in 2022, that after building out a statement and framework, after doing extensive research and work around equity gaps, that we would work side by side with other agencies to build out an equity plan. This has been something that has been proposed by many parents, advocates, educators alike. And the idea is that we would not necessarily think of a one-size-fits-all approach for our schools, but think about how we might advance equity as a one singular goal across the many LEAs that we have here in the city. And so that is the proposed multi-year equity vision that ideally the board can help lead and champion. The second highlighted red section on page 1 is the proposed equity statement. This is the revised statement. In our personal emails, board members, you should have seen the document that captured board members' feedback. Again, this is very much a draft form, and so my hope is tonight that we can have initial reactions. I will go directly into this document and capture notes and thoughts and feedback, but I did try to honor as much of the feedback that I received as possible. The third highlighted section on page 1 is the proposed equity framework. And this is just giving a high level overview. The point of a framework, and I know that's a pretty ambiguous phrase, like what do you mean an equity framework? The idea here is that this framework would serve as a common tool and a common way of approaching not only our policies, resolutions, projects, but also a way for us to reflect on our internal rhythms and decisions as a board to ensure that we are putting forth equity and keeping it central to everything that we're doing as a body. And that the single most important goal is that it's all working to accelerate student outcomes in the district, which I know we all care deeply about. As I mentioned before, on pages 2 and 3 is more information connected to the equity framework. Again, we're not going to delve here deeply tonight, although I still welcome initial reactions and feedback. The hope is that the framework is what you're going to go talk to your neighbors, your constituents, educators in your wards about, and then bring to our next working session feedback that we can tear it apart, build on it, etc. You'll see on page 2 are the framework principles, and they are largely bucketed in 3 categories, which include academic achievement and growth, which is 1. Second, student, educator, community, and human capital representation. That is a mouthful. And then 3rd, educator and team capacity. You will see in the second column of this chart that these 3 principles are aiming to improve outcomes, representation, and access to development and growth for educators as well as our own state board team members. And then the 3rd column to the right were examples that I tried to capture of what this could look like. The idea here is not to be overly prescriptive, but again, to give voice and guidance to how we're going to keep equity at the center of our work as a board. And then on page 3, you will see a high level empty chart which I'm hoping we will build out over the next 2 months, to build out principal statements connected to each of our authorities. And so just to give you a guidance of how you might want to look at this document, you'll notice across the top are those framework principles that I've already called out: academic achievement and growth, student, educator, community, and human capital representation, and educator and team capacity. You'll see on the left-hand side, the state board's authority. This is not an exhaustive list. And so part of the feedback you may want to provide is something's missing, or why don't we add to this list? In full transparency, I captured a lot of these authority statements off of our website, as well as things that we regularly revisit in our ongoing work. And so the idea is that for each of these authority areas, we would build out a principal statement of how we're working towards advancing, for instance, our state accountability plan pursuant to ESSA, to accelerate academic achievement and growth, to put forward student, educator, community, and human capital representation, and how we will advance educator and team capacity, so on and so forth. You will also notice on the left-hand side at the bottom portion our internal board functions, which includes governance, appointments, board meetings, hearings, professional development. And that professional development piece, at least my initial thought, was for both office staff as well as board members. And again, all of this is up for debate and conversation, but this was the initial thought. And then lastly, on page 4 of this document, it's more of a resource. At the top are some reference frameworks you may want to review if you haven't already done so, including some of our local state agency documents. And then at the bottom, a list of stakeholders we likely will need and want to engage with to ensure that we've sought very broad feedback and representation in building out this framework and equity statement. Not included in the list of stakeholders, and not least amongst these are constituents and educators in our individual wards. So I know that was a lot. I thought it was important for at least me to talk through the document to at least orient people to what they were looking at. For the sake of time, I would say let's spend time discussing the equity statement, the language, if there are initial reactions, both positive and or opportunities to refine this. I would say let's discuss there. And then if there are any questions around how you might want to engage and seek feedback from constituents, educators in your ward on the equity framework template, let's focus there. I would say let's keep it in those 2 areas and touch base offline just for the sake of time. Last thing I would say, for these stakeholders that are called out on page 4, understanding that there are ongoing relationships, I do want to defer to Ruth and Marcus and their leadership, as well as John Paul, to determine which board members may make the most sense to reach out to these individuals, so we don't have a lot of folk reaching out to the same stakeholders. So I would just ask that when the time comes that you prioritize educators and residents of your ward. And what I can guarantee that we will do is to ensure that each board member that wants to will have stakeholders from this list, as well as others we may add, to reach out to, but that we will do it in a strategic, aligned fashion versus ad hoc. So before we dig into the equity statement, are there any questions that I can quickly answer regarding any of this?
Can I actually just make a suggestion?
Yeah.
My thought is that to get into the nitty-gritty of the language would be time consuming, and that is something we could actually do. Like, I started doing it, I'm not done, and I feel like I can just send it to you, and you can put that all together. Whereas
I'm totally down for that.
Yeah. And then
I would just say, Emily, if I could we did that the first time. I think one of the things you lose is the back and forth between members who may have conflicting recommendations. And so I'm totally good to do that. The reason why I wanted to elevate this now is there were some recommendations that were in tension with one another. So for instance, there was one comment that said, keep the phrase standardized testing in. There was another comment said, we should remove emphasis on standardized testing. And then it puts me in a place where I'm trying to honor everyone's opinion. So if people are okay with that, I'm totally fine with taking it offline.
I have one English teacher question. If the equity statement that we worked on stopped after academic needs of the student, which is line 5.
You're on page 1.
Right. I'm at the proposed equity statement.
Yep.
And the rest of that whole, see, it's not a equity statement anymore. It's an equity paragraph, and it's a really long paragraph. I think the equity statement ought to stop at the word student, and the information that goes on from that is part of the equity framework. And I'll be glad to work with you on that. But I just think that if you're making an equity statement and it's like 150 words or 100 words or whatever that is, that's not a statement. It's more of something else. I don't know what you call it. And I know that an equity statement is a generalized kind of a thing. And we talked about those first 2 sentences. And I know we fought that back and forth with those first 2 sentences. I just think that should be the statement.
Yeah, no, you'll notice.
You understand what I mean?
I totally hear you. And you'll notice I just captured that comment in the document. Again, I think that's a prime example that the initial feedback given on equity statement did, I think you're absolutely right, stop there. There were follow-up conversations, which again puts me at a place where I'm now having to go back and forth. And that's why I just wanted us, if not now, I do think it will be important to get everyone who is interested in doing so to provide feedback so that we can have those conversations amongst one another.
Okay.
But I did capture that. Thank you for providing that feedback. Emily, I think you had a second point that may have gotten cut off.
Yeah, so I guess, first of all, I'm just really excited that you put so much into this. I mean, it's much more than I think any of us were expecting. And so to have a framework, I think, is really helpful. And it goes to what I was going to suggest, which is that it seems important to me that this becomes a document that we actually use, you know, that it's not just a statement for the sake of having a statement like every organization has. And so to that end, I think having a framework that we can actually pull out when whether we're having a working meeting or in our committee meetings, I think helpful. So just putting it out there that I think we should make that a practice, that we actually start our meetings by having some kind of protocol and practice that we use to check in with these. And it doesn't mean we have to spend a half an hour each time, but that whether it's just reminding ourselves that this is how we're framing what we're doing, or it's actually like connecting to a specific piece of that framework. I think it's really important and useful. So thank you for that. And then in terms of bringing it to our constituents, I was just wondering if you had specific questions that you want us to ask. Would it be helpful for us to all be asking similar questions about it?
So part of the, yes, great question. Part of the follow-up to this meeting will be an extensive email with both example principle statements, which are purely examples, but just to give a frame of what a principle statement might be, as well as sample questions that you may ask constituents and educators in your ward. I would just say, do not feel confined to those questions, as well as a template and document that I'm going to ask that you capture notes in, just to make things as seamless as possible from transcribing things when we bring feedback back. So yes, after this meeting, you will get all of that information in terms of next steps for the framework.
Zachary, can I ask a quick, and I don't mean to interrupt other members, but Can I ask just a logistical question? Like, what the deadlines are and timelines for this? Just noting that if we are going to continue to have this on the potential agenda for next week, this does sort of need to be done by Friday, which leaves us a day and a half. So
Nope. Yep. Great question. I believe I captured it in the email I sent, but it will be in the follow-up email. The idea is that we wouldn't pass this and vote until August or September. And so that we will have plenty of time to come back and hash it out multiple times to make sure everyone is super comfortable and clear on the vision. So, but it does not need to be on the agenda for the public meetings, that it would be on the working sessions. Great question.
Ruth, I think you have next. You're on mute, Ruth.
And I said, I'm giving up on my technological hand. I'm just using my hand. But one thought I have, Zach, and other people can see if they agree. I sense that you want a real good discussion, and part of that discussion does buy in people to exactly what it is about. And I must say, I'm trying in my mind to sort of figure that all out. And I wonder if it wouldn't make sense to try to do what we used to call a working group, right? I mean, just to sort of pull people together who want to spend 2 hours really talking it out, understanding it, coming to sort of a joint vision about where we're going with this.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think for some of us, Dr. Kasoi, Dr. Sutter, you, myself, we're probably overstretched with committee meetings. I know there's a lot of overlap, so I would not recommend adding another, as well as staff that, is fielding a lot of meetings. What Dr. Kasoi has done is put it on the well-rounded education committee agenda. And so I would just invite people that want to lean in here to join those meetings. And if not, I'm happy to have one-off conversations with folks. But I think that's a great idea, Ruth.
Okay.
Or President Weidenberg. Sorry, I didn't mean to address you.
I go by Ruth.
Yes, and just to, and we can close our conversation here just for the sake of time, unless someone has burning feedback that they really want to share. But Ruth, just to give you an idea of how I would imagine this happening, is that at the beginning of this year, if I'm not mistaken, and last year, we took a vote on what are going to be our priorities for the year. And it seemed to all center on things that board members heard or as they were being responsive to constituents and advocates, which is totally fine. I think this framework would slightly shift that board members would then need to ideally make connections to say, I want to advance X topic and X focus for the board, and this is how it will advance our equity framework, which here are 3 principles. Does that make sense? And so board members would need to ideally really put forth the effort to advance topics, issues, resolutions that are going to really advance equity in the city. Does that help?
Yes. I mean, there's still a lot to discuss, but
Yes, of course.
I mean, I knew that part, but yes.
Jack, that I don't know if that's it.
Thank you. Yep, it was. And thanks so very much for all of the effort you put into this. It's been a while since I've looked at this issue, and I think it's been a little while since we've talked in a group about this. So can you remind me, how is the current equity statement, how is it informed by all the work that the board did, like 6 years ago around an equity statement, and as recently as 1.5 years ago through the ESSA committee, and all of the dozens and scores of hours that the equity committee put into their equity statement under Ms. Woodruff at the time, and how that informed where we are today?
Great question. I would say the skeleton of the current version of this equity statement is the ESSA Equity Committee's equity statement. In fact, we started there and took feedback. And if I recall, I believe we heard from Ruth, Jessica, Emily, Frazier, John Paul, maybe Marcus. And so I would just say it looks different. It does. And that's because of the feedback that we received from
it would give us a lens through which all of our work would go. why don't we test it out before we actually adopt it and put either the African American teacher resolution or another resolution through that process and actually live that process in real time to see if it's going to do what we intend it to do. What I'd really hate is for us to spend another 4 months on an equity statement and a process if it's not going to actually lead to the outcomes that we want. And I think maybe we should just test that out, maybe not even on that resolution, but on our work for the next 2 months, period.
I love that idea. I love that idea. And so what I can do, and if it's okay, I would love to thought partner with you as before sending out that follow-up email with the board of just like what that could look like over the next 2-3 months. But I love that. And I just want to stress the idea is not to be super prescriptive and say, as a board, we're not going to do X, Y, and Z. Instead, the more assets-based way of saying it is, we're going to keep equity central to everything we're doing. And so if board members are then pushed to make connections, I think if it's top of mind, we're going to focus on it more. If we focus on it more, we're going to advance it, and hopefully we see payoff from it. And if there are things, resolutions, topics, focus, panels, you name it, that we're putting forth that board members are really struggling to make a connection to equity, then I would argue maybe we shouldn't be doing it. So for the sake of time, I'm happy to yield back time, President Wattenberg. I'm also happy to entertain questions offline. But thank you all. I think this is going to be great. And the hope is, the last thing I would just say, that when that email comes, that over the next month, you will engage parents and educators in your ward. And it doesn't have to be super extensive, but that it's an ongoing process. I'm not sure if we're going to have an August meeting at this point, but if not, the idea would be that this would be up for a vote at the September public meeting, the statement and the framework together.
Thank you. The next is the committee reports. Mr. O'Sullivan.
Thank you. So next week, we're going to be presenting our yearly student advisory committee report. Deja isn't here right now, but basically the report is split up into 3 parts. The subcommittee, which Deja led, which is on post-secondary preparation, and it deals with, really its goal is looking at having an education, a high school education that prepares us high school students successfully for our next phase of life, not just college, also looking at things like financial literacy, just really life readiness. And she'll be there presenting next week with me, and also a couple other student advisory committee members there as well. We'll be there to answer questions, serve on a panel, things of that sort. And then the other 2 parts of the report, one of them is the subcommittee, which I led, which is on maximizing productivity in the classroom. Basically, that was split up into like 4 different parts, essentially: access to learning, teaching/learning styles, the relationship with the teacher, and the mental well-being of students and teachers. And basically, we came up with a list of recommendations. We had findings. I also forgot to say, Deja subcommittee also had surveys they sent out for students to fill out. Same with my subcommittee. And we basically came up with a list of recommendations for OSSE, LEAs, schools to look at. And then the final part of the report is on, as I said earlier, distance learning, and also preparing for how schools, if they are reopened in any capacity next year, what needs to happen. So we pretty much broke that down into 3 parts, which is 1, how distance learning can be better next year, how it can be better carried out. And then another part was on what needs to happen before any sort of modified reopening. And that's just getting students on the same page, making sure students' voices are heard, things of that nature. And then the final is what should happen if there's a second outbreak of COVID-19 and what that means for our schools and students. So the committee report is like 17 pages long. It's pretty detailed. Deja and I spent a lot of time writing it, and we had like the final part of the report on distance learning was obviously like a recent development because of what happened in March. But yeah, we'll be there to present alongside other student advisory committee members next Wednesday, and John Paul will send out the report Friday.
Thank you. Frazier with teacher retention.
Yes, you all should have a copy of the revised resolution. Nothing has changed except lines 55 through 66. We've taken out a bit of the paragraph that begins with line 55. It reads now, be it further resolved, the state board calls on district LEAs to review their teacher evaluation systems and frameworks to address the issues of subjectivity and inconsistency, as well as concerns with evaluator experience and knowledge as raised by teachers. And line 61 begins, be it further resolved, the state board asks the Office of the OASI to provide guidance to district LEAs about professional development and mentoring programs that are directed towards teachers with under 5 years of experience to assist them and incorporates the differentiated professional development that targets the specific needs and growth points of the individual teacher and allows them to learn and observe from the experts in their field. And those paragraphs have been changed because of the input that we got at our last business meeting. And I want to thank everyone for that. So we've simplified it and taken out some language that some people didn't agree with. And so now it's the same thing that I was telling Zach. We try to make it as simple as possible. And that's what will come up next week when we vote on it, right, John Paul? Any questions?
Ruth, go ahead.
So this is really a question, it's partly to Frazier, but it's partly to everybody. Can I assume that based on this amendment, on these two amendments, that we now have sort of unanimous support for the resolution? Is that part of what we have achieved with this?
I hope so. I know that when we last talked about it, that there were a couple of members who had really good input about what they didn't agree with. So we tried to take everything that everybody didn't agree with out.
I have a question. I guess my concern last time was just that if there, and I know there was, I don't want to bring up Empower Ed, but it made me also think about other groups, like DEC and WTU, other teacher organizations. And as Jessica pointed out, individual teachers not associated with a specific group. So, I guess I'm wondering if in the interim, you've had an opportunity to share those concerns, like the particular points of concern or the whole resolution with them really, and to get feedback. Because I guess beyond the specifics, my main concern was that we don't want to pass a resolution that the direct stakeholders don't agree with, I think. That's my concern. So I don't know if others share that, but that was more than the specifics. That was my concern, I think.
Well, I can't imagine that. Just from my viewpoint as a teacher, this sets up a framework about mentorship and what the teacher what our survey brought out as important points. So to me, it can't get any more innocuous than what it says, and still have power to it.
I know the power to it is an issue. I understand that. I would just say, I mean, I like the changes. I think that they respond to concerns that Empower Ed raised, but again, I think that was just one organization, and it makes me wonder if there are other concerns. And I think it would be worthwhile finding out.
This wasn't driven by any one stakeholder at all.
Understood. No, understood. I guess that's my point, nor should it be. But we want to make sure that the folks who are immediately impacted would agree with this. And I guess what I would point out is, you know, asking OSSI to create a statewide
no, it's not. It's not asking. Please don't read it that way. Okay. It's not. It's not asking. It's not asking OSSI to do that. It's asking OSSI to provide guidance to the LEAs. That's all it's doing. It's not mandating. It's not doing. It's not even asking. We took out ask because the ask was in the previous one. Now it says to provide guidance. Now it's okay.
Now I'm talking about line 58. The state board asked the Office of the State Superintendent of Education to provide guidance to, oh, no, you're right. Sorry. Okay, it's the next one, starting 65, to implement a statewide professional development program, training school level leadership. So again, what's that? Yeah, so I'm not even opposed to that. I'm just, it's a question about what, you know, those other organizations that represent teachers and what teachers, do they agree with that? I would be concerned about passing a resolution that raise concerns for those direct stakeholders. So that's my only concern.
Okay. That's it for me, John Paul. If no one else has any questions or comments.
No.
I guess it's a comment. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to say no substantive comment on the resolution, but just wanting to share appreciation, Dr. O'Leary, for just being patient in the amount of work that has gone into making this an improved resolution. So just thank you.
You're welcome. All right, Ruth. Yeah.
So mine is really a question, and Fraser and I tried a few times to connect on this and didn't, so I'm just going to raise it, which is that we call on OSSI. So this is really it's a discussion, really. We call on OSSI to develop the guidance. And I guess my question, and it really is a question, is what is preventing LEAs from doing it? And I feel like it's a money issue, not a guidance issue. And I just wonder if we want to say something that is also oriented towards the council, that we encourage the council to, you know, create a pot of money to support professional development for early year teachers, and even at that point indicate that at that point there ought to be further input from stakeholders in schools about what that could look like. And I wonder, it partly responds to Emily, but the big thing is to focus it as much on resources, with that being a big part of the obstacle, not the guidance so much. I mean, question.
I don't have an answer. See, that's way past my technical expertise. John Paul, could you answer that?
Or other board members. I mean, it's partly where we want to put our effort, where we see this this going.
I'm just talking about the legality of it, or the practicality of bringing all these other people into it. That's why I was asking John Paul.
I mean, I'm happy to defer to other board members if they have comments and suggestions. I don't, I'm not really sure.
Ruth, this is Jessica. My question to you is, are you saying that you think LEAs would do this but for funding?
I think that's a big obstacle. I mean, it's a question. I would assume that is more the obstacle than that somebody hasn't provided guidance. But like I say, it's a question. It's a question more than anything else. But
my hesitation is, I mean, I think there is always a need for funds to support any mandate. My concern is that council is more likely to make it a mandate rather than to issue guidance. And I think mandating something becomes complicated.
But what council could do is create a sort of money for pilots, or money to try things out.
My experience generally, and I could be, I could be off base on this, I'm certainly happy to be corrected, is that the council typically says, we want to see a thing done, we'll put money behind it, we want data on points certain by XYZ time. The pilot stuff I've seen done well typically comes out of OSSI, and it's often in the form of a grant. So there's either a competitive grant opportunity or a pilot grant opportunity, like the community schools program. No one is mandated to do it, but there was a grant made available and guidance that went along with it that worked. So that's my 2 cents.
No, and I like that 2 cents. And my only point is the money for the grants, I think, comes from the council. That's sort of how I'm thinking of it. That what you're describing is right, is that you get some money and then you're able to engage OSSI in developing some guidelines for what the pilots would be like. But
I would, I'm not, the teacher retention committee isn't finished. And I mean, this is important to me. And so we passed the resolution, and I have no problem with keeping their feet in the fire, whoever they is or they are, because I think it's very important. I don't have any problem with working on this ad infinitum to get it done. I think that we need to get it done. And I think I tried to make the language as general as possible, because that's not what it said first. At first it said, we're sort of telling OSSI what to do. We really can't do that. I think that when you're talking about, telling the council to do something is even further from realistic. I just, I'm not going to say trust me, but I'm not going to let it go until it's done.
One other thing that I would note as well is that we do also have legislation pending at the council that would speak to some of the data issues that we were talking about too, which is another one of the things that the teacher retention committee can also work on as well. I think just in practicality terms, funding right now is for a new program, I think is not going to happen. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't ask for it in future years or to look for other ways of doing it in future years. But I think there's also a number of things that can be done without necessarily huge amounts of funding, right? I think community schools is a good example of what a grant program can do and that type of thing. But I think there's also, I think even through things that the district government already has access to, like Microsoft Teams. I think most of you know that I'm currently in a program where I'm getting certified in human resources. Most of the work that we're doing there is through Microsoft Teams because it's something that all district employees already have access to. And so there are things that you can do through that, where you could do mentoring in a group session, or you could do a WebEx training, or there are many ways of getting to this mentorship program, which wasn't require extra funding, I think, at this moment in time as a pilot or something like that.
Thank you, John Paul. I'm done.
And thank you, Fraser.
Sure.
Dr. Sutter, social studies? She may have stepped away for a moment. So I just want to move on. Well-rounded education?
Sure. There haven't been any real changes since we last reported out, but I will just give a recap, which is that our funding was lost. And so our work in progress, which was to have a all teachers survey to the well-rounded education part, was to sort of find out the extent to which schools are able to provide all students with a well-rounded education. That has sort of been tabled. And so what we're talking about at our next meeting on Friday is sort of learning what the needs are around well-rounded education by reaching out to our constituents and hopefully talking with relevant department chairs, BCPS and LEAs, and maybe shifting to providing resources based on what we find out, and providing recommendations about specifically related to our current context. So that's where we are with that. And Zach, I don't know if you wanted to give an update on the standards work.
Nope, I think you did a good job.
Okay.
Things are in progress.
Jessica's back.
Thanks. Dr. Sutter?
Sorry, friends. One of my favorite Ward 6 establishments is doing a meal tonight, specifically where 50% of the proceeds go to Black Lives Matter. So I was picking up my takeout at the front door. Very excited. Social Studies Committee met this morning, and we made some important decisions about the Standards Advisory Committee and the process by which we'll select applicants from the pool. So a quick high-level overview. We have 75 applicants currently.
Wow.
Super exciting. And we have a lot of diverse representation. Though we are going to work to increase the diversity of that pool, we're lacking in some early childhood education experience. We definitely think we could get a more racially and ethnically diverse pool from which to select. And so we've extended the deadline to Monday, close of business, so that we give folks some time to do some more targeted outreach. Another group we feel like we've got underrepresented at the moment is from institutions of higher education. So we want to do some targeted outreach to make sure we get more university-based folks in the applicant pool. Once we have those applicants in, the staff of the state board will work to de-identify the applications so that we are working only with folks' roles and short answer responses. And the Social Studies Standards Committee will review the total applicant pool and rank those applicants into sort of sorted groups, those that we would absolutely want as part of the panel, those that would be our second choices, and those that would be sort of our third group of choices. We'll give those back to the staff on the 18th. And I think we're going to set that deadline at noon on the 18th, giving our staff some adequate time to pull things together. And then the committee will convene again on the 19th to discuss who has made the sort of finalist round of our pool, and from there select the final members of the committee. During that time, we'll invite our staff to provide any other sort of identifying information that may be helpful. So for instance, if we've gone through, but we've picked all third grade teachers and no fourth, fifth, or sixth grade teachers, for instance, if that wasn't part of the de-identified data, our staff will be able to provide us with any sort of supplemental information to help us make the decision. The rationale for that process, going from a more de-identified process to giving us just enough information to make sure we've got a diversified panel, is that we want to make this as fair as possible. We want to make sure that we are really choosing folks based on what we understand the expertise they might bring is, as well as the responses they give and how that aligns with the missions for the panel, that the panel is willing to take on this issue of creating more culturally responsive standards, of working on standards that are designed to be anti-racist, that have the expertise to help us bring knowledge-rich curricula, knowledge-rich standards rather, into the early grades, and those that have experience in and interest in working with fostering civic participation. So that's the latest and greatest from the Social Studies Standards Committee. The one other thing I would say is that once we've selected that panel, we'll plan to go ahead and make that announcement during our off week in June. So not at our public meeting. There's simply not time to turn that around. But the following week, so that we can be ready for the first meeting of this advisory committee on July the 7th. We'll also at that point be making notifications to folks who we didn't select and letting them know about other opportunities to engage in the process, both through public comment as experts that we might pull in to speak to our panel of advisors, and or letting them know that OSCE will convene a writing panel, which will also, we hope, be a public application process. Any questions or comments? Ashley, and then I'll come to Rachel.
Yeah. Hey, Jessica. So I had a quick question regarding my earlier email to you today. Looking at the demographic data, will that be put aside? I understand why you're doing it, and I understand how well intentioned it is. Will that be looked at, or will that be part of the blind, parsed out information when we look at the actual answers? When the committee looks at the applications?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think we got into that level of detail today. I am deferring to staff on how we've done it before. So for instance, for the ESSA task force or the grad requirements task force, whether the de-identified review included that demographic information.
Okay, because I mean, looking at this, I think it's great that we want a diverse representation. I think that looking at it from an outreach perspective is fantastic. But me, you know what? If you're saying I want 5 females, okay, or I want 5 people of color, that really, looking at that, I wonder if I end up being selected. Am I there just because I'm a female, or am I there actually because my credentials are worth me being there? And that is something that we need to consider when we're looking at that. The other thing I wanted to ask was, with our high school graduation requirements task force, it was opened up the review process for all of the applications for any member on the board. Will we be doing the same for this application process, or will just the committee be selecting the applications?
That's a really good question, Ashley. I think today when we talked about it, we said the committee. I have no objection if any other member wants to review the applications. I don't know if other members of the committee have objections, but I certainly don't. Alex did tell me that we're up to 80 applicants. So just know that you might be in for a heavy dose of reading, but I would certainly welcome anyone who wants to read to join us.
Okay, yeah, just saying, with what we did with the high school graduation task force, I think it was several rounds. We had all of the applications, we reviewed them, anyone who wanted to be a part of that review process, and we sat down over multiple days to review out those and select the members of the who would actually be on the advisory committee. So
it's really helpful.
And I would definitely love to be a part of the review process if it's, allowable. So
Great.
With other members of the social studies committee. So
Great. John Paul, is there any reason we couldn't welcome more folks to do it?
No reason at all.
Okay. So then what I will do is I will make sure, Ashley, that when we get the information, that in the same way that the social studies committee emails always go out to the whole crew, that we'll do the same thing with the applications, and folks can just opt in if they're interested.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you.
That's a good question. I'm always glad to have more readers. Fraser, it looked like you had a question for us.
I have two quick ones. How many members are going to be on the committee?
I think we said 15 to 19 and no more than 19.
And how many of those members are social studies people? Is there any kind of a limit? Is there any kind of a number? Because I think that there should be I don't know what the number is, but I think that there should be a number of people that are specifically social studies people.
Tell me what you mean when you say social studies people, because I have a couple different ideas in my head.
Social studies teachers.
So yes, our expectation, what we talked about for who we wanted on the panel was that we wanted to make sure the panel included teachers. Oh, and I should say this. The other group that is wholly underrepresented is students. So we are also making a push to get more student applicants to the panel. So we want teachers on the panel. We want students on the panel. We want LEA administrators on the panel. So folks who do curriculum, folks who lead schools or LEAs. We want higher ed folks with expertise in one of the domains. We want higher ed folks with experience training pre-service educators. So all of those are the kinds of folks we definitely want. And then we have folks from the state board and from OSSE facilitating and sitting in on the panel, but not as voting members, if you will.
Right. I just want to make sure that there is a fifth or a fourth of the people are real, so they know what they're talking about.
And Fraser, this is another great time to reiterate too that there is a second group of folks that OSSE is going to be convening, which are going to be the writers of the standards. And in that group specifically, they are absolutely going to be targeting practitioners, right? People who are teachers of social studies. So there are multiple opportunities for teachers, not only on our advisory committee, but also in the technical writing process as well. So I just want to note that opportunity is also coming for teachers.
Great.
Thank you for that good reminder, John Paul.
Can I just say something real quick, which is, sure. I think to Ashley's point about, people wondering whether they were chosen for their demographics, I think in this situation, it's actually very valid to be chosen for your demographic because when you're talking about social studies, it is important to have, a woman's perspective, to have to have perspectives from the full range of folks who should be represented in the standards. So I don't think it's a conflict at all here. I understand that in some situations it is, thorny, but here I don't think so. So I just want to put that out.
I'll say I disagree upon any quotas, but furthermore, it can be troubling at least, but illegal at possibly the worst. So depending on how we're doing it.
Yeah, I think all of these points are well received. That I do think there is value in having broad, diverse viewpoints represented on the panel, and I think we must be careful in how we obtain those diverse perspectives, so that we make sure we operate both within the bounds of the law, but also that we're really finding folks who are interested in and well equipped to help us do the work, which is to review the current standards, identify places where there are weaknesses and opportunities, and make a list of recommendations to OSSE to guide the writing of the new standards by their group, which we hope will be a majority of educators and other experts in the social studies. So if folks have other questions, being mindful of time, I'm going to stop here. Please feel free to email me and let me know. If you have folks in mind who have not yet applied but might help us meet some of those gaps in our current diversity, students, early childhood educators, folks working with institutions of higher ed, we are definitely interested to have you help share the application more widely. Thanks, John Paul.
Thank you. Ruth, on research?
Yeah, so I'm very aware of the hour. Even when I redid this, I thought we'd be long done and we're losing people. And speaking for myself, I'm losing my brain cells. And I know we have another committee and I think Marcus has some new business. So what I want to say is you all got a document. And let me say, this is in a way, especially towards Ashley and Karen, because the rest of, and Fraser, because the rest of us who are on this call have been in these research committee meetings. But we've developed a document that sort of reflects our thinking to date, not perfectly. And it also tries to reflect where there's some discussion, where there's debates, where there's tensions, where there's individuals thinking different things. We're trying to collect sort of different ideas about how we go forward on this as a way of trying to create a consensus about what is working well with our current rating system and what we want to potentially review. And we're looking, moving towards a place where we would want to go into some community discussions on this, probably with some document that we would bring to everybody in July. But this was our chance. We really wanted to hear back from people, especially about the purpose, which is sort of the first part of this document, why we're doing this, what we think the purpose of the rating system is, what we think the purpose of the review is. And I'll just say one thing on the timing, because that's come up, is the way the STAR framework was developed initially. It was agreed that the first 3 years would be one way, and the third year is coming up with the third rating would be in December. Yeah. And then if we wanted to change it in any way, OSSE would need to be able to go to the Department of Ed, which would have to be done, assuming the rules don't change, in March. So this is the time, if we want to have ample time for us to discuss, for the public to discuss, and for OSSE to sort of do some thinking about how to do that and put some proposals together. This is our timeline. Now, it is complicated, and it is partly complicated by the fact that we're in the middle of COVID and there's not tests, and therefore what? We're not going to have a rating next December. On the other hand, it's fortuitous because, as a number of us have talked in our committee meetings, it means that there's more time. There's not going to be a rating in December. And so it creates sort of an opening to sort of think about this more openly, and to think about, gosh, in this new climate where you don't have tests, how would you measure progress? What would you want to know about school quality? What would you want to know about whether our students are doing well or not, or what's going on in the school? So it sort of forced all of us, I think, to think in some different ways, and that's a plus. So that's where we are, and I welcome comment, but I also understand that it's past 8. So I will also take it offline, but encourage it now insofar as people want to engage.
Ruth, I would like to engage in the process. Not tonight, of course. You can hear me, right?
I can hear you, yes. And I can see your beautiful smile, even though your video's not on. I can hear it.
Okay, thank you. But I think it's an issue that we need to just start, because there are some people, the way the different members view it now, I think we need to have some open discussions about how we see it best for our student population. Okay, so maybe, I don't know if you want to do another committee, how you want to handle it, but I think we need to have at least 3 or 4 discussions before we make a determination about how we handle it, how we want to do it.
Well, Caroline, there's the process sort of looks like this. There are multiple opportunities at various points in a timeline. The way we're now thinking about it is that so we're in June. Yeah. That we would, based on the meeting we had today, based on the discussion today, based on further input we get, create a document. It's not a final statement in any way. It's sort of a statement that would sort of capture where we are on the discussion and sort of raise some of the tensions that have tensions in the sense of, these are dilemmas, right? If you do this and not this, what does that mean? And try to capture where our consensus points are, and use that as a way to generate some questions that all of us could bring out to our wards, and in other ways have some public discussion. maybe have some people come, sort of do a big, do some public testimony on it in September. And then that would put us in a position maybe in October to actually vote on a set of recommendations. So there's sort of different points along the way before any of this is sort of finalized and moving forward in some definitive way. And we will discuss, I mean, I guess, so we'll end up discussing it obviously at the July working session as well.
Bruce, I don't have a problem with what you're saying at all. As long as we have enough meetings and enough input from the entire board as to the direction in which we want to go, and it's unanimous, and the outcome is unanimous. The decision that we make comes from the entire board, and not just one committee or one or whatever. It should, in other words, we should examine the issue, decide how we want to handle it as a board, and then vote on it, and then it'll be done.
Well, we actually have more votes in there. We actually have more discussion points in there than that. So hopefully that will work for you, but also, but let me just, you are welcome to come to our next committee meeting if you want to participate in that. I'm willing to get on the phone, and I think we'll have to make this sort of a bigger piece of what we do in July anyway at the working meeting. But this is one of those times. So I encourage you, to weigh in now if you want.
No, I'm just saying, we can have all the committee meetings we want. However, it still has to go before the entire board, discussed and then voted on before we make a final decision. That's all I'm saying.
No, that's absolutely. And as we move forward towards that, I'm eager to get as much input as possible so we can just keep working it through, trying to create consensus where we can and acknowledge where there's not, so we can try to figure out if there's ways to address it. But that's all I'll say now.
Yeah, that's what I said. That's all I'm saying is you can start as a committee, whatever, however you want to do it, but the entire board needs to know what's going on, and it should be a vote by the entire board before we make a decision, before we move forward. Okay?
Okay, Jessica?
So I've been vocal in the research meetings, so I won't retrod that ground, but I think it's worth noting California today apparently is moving forward on adding a growth model to its ESSA framework, because it doesn't actually have a growth model. It has a change over time model. And there's some really interesting articles I'll send out to the board about that process, as well as some interesting feedback from Morgan Polikoff, the gentleman whose paper I shared with the research committee earlier this week, describing that he did not think that the process by which this working group went through was very effective. So he's a person who is in favor of modifications to the model. He's a person who's in favor of adding in this growth model into California's model, but he felt like the way that this committee, this work group put together by the board went about it was not particularly effective. And I'll share that with the whole board, but I think it's worth us learning not just from positive examples of other states. I know there's energy from certain members of the board in having open conversation about ratings versus dashboards. California has a dashboard, but I think it's also worth us learning from the mistakes other states make. And so I want to just put that out there, that as Karen is making this point, I do not think we should belabor discussion for the sake of having discussion, but I do think we've got to think about, are we making progress? Are we hearing each other? Are we introducing new ideas, or are we retrotting old ground? And do we get to a place where we can continue to move forward on ideas versus come to stalemates? So at any rate, I just want to say that because it's prescient that it happened today, and there's a bunch of talk about it, given that it is a state I know that some members have looked at fondly in terms of their model, and I'd love to make sure we also learn from their mistakes.
I look forward to looking at it. That's all I have.
Marcus on Administrative Committee?
So not a lot on the administrative side. I know I talked to everyone a little earlier about the committee really closely monitoring the evolving situation around the reopening, and so we're definitely working on that. As all of you know, and I'm sure John Paul will get into more of this because I know he still has to give an update as well. But we had our budget hearing. And we're able to really articulate, I think, a lot of the transformative work the board was able to do over the last year with the funds we were given. And I think also clearly articulate the disadvantage we would be in continuing that work if our need for appropriation wasn't met. And obviously, right, the budget hearing is just the beginning of that work. And we'll have a lot of advocacy to do as a body and as hopefully individual members over the next few weeks to get some of that funding restored. But it's something we're paying close attention to and hopefully we'll recoup so that we can continue some of the critical work, especially that the critical work around research where we took a pretty deep cut. Am I forgetting anything else out of our admin meetings, John Paul? I think those were the big things we were looking at. So no, I appreciate everybody. Thanks.
The one thing that I would mention related to the budget is we generally by now would be examining our budget for the next fiscal year, because typically we vote on that in July. So even though we're not quite done with the FY21 budget, we should be in the process of developing the FY22 budget. And frankly, I just haven't had time to work on it. And so at some point soon, you will be seeing some documents related to a proposal for the FY22. I mean, it will go through the administrative committee first, but just be aware that will be coming likely sometime in July and August for you to review and make some decisions on related to that process. It seems a little strange that we're already talking about FY22 budget, but we are, and that's how the process works. So.
I have a couple of questions. I'm not trying to keep everybody because they got to catch the metro. Oops, my fault. Are we meeting in August?
That's a question. Sorry, go ahead, Marcus.
No, I was going to say it's something we talked about. I think there's been a desire to, given that we think, moving into the next school year, we've got a lot of important discussions coming up. We'll make that decision, I think, in the next few weeks. I think circle the wagons with members of the board to make sure, if we decide to move forward, we'll have a critical mass available.
I just want to say I will be away.
Okay. I understand all of that. I just think it's critically important that we meet in August, especially this year, with the way things. So just to find out some information about what is going to be happening, because we don't know what July is going to look like, much less August. The other thing is we voted on the new members for the Student Advisory Committee. When is that going to be published?
So I have not received input from all board members yet from your to-do list last week. So if you have not if you've not reviewed that information and sent it to me, please do so as quickly as you can.
Oh, okay. I wasn't trying to out anybody.
I mean, I could name names, but
No. That's all I got.
Anybody for new business?
Oh, I thought that was new business.
Oh.
that was admin, Frazier, but it fit right in.
Oh, okay.
And Jessica, I think I saw your hand for new business.
Yeah, I imagine it's the same business that Marcus wants to raise. So I will happily defer to my colleague if he would like to raise it, and I'll just add my 2 cents.
Well, no, I think anyway, I think, I don't know, we'll tag team it.
We can tag team it.
But I'll make sure that all members really pay attention to the communication that John Paul sent out earlier today, which is just a helpful primer on information around policing in schools. And the reason that that was sent out was because the state board, among other city leaders, have been reached out to by groups of advocates, rightfully so, in response to all this going on around police violence across the country, around the board taking a stand on getting police out of schools. And I think thinking about police out of schools, but also thinking about alternatives to policing in schools. And so, and the reason I'm introducing this is because what I want to do, hopefully, is have progressive conversations with all of you over the next few weeks that hopefully takes us towards presenting a resolution in July around how our city can better invest in alternatives to policing that don't, I think, put our students in the position to have negative interactions with law enforcement. I think it's also important to realize that the institution of policing comes from, I think, has roots in racism and has had a negative impact on Black and Brown communities. And so as we think about reforming the way we think about public safety, but also what we think guarantees safety in these spaces, I think examining alternatives to policing is something that our city should do. I think looking at the most recent numbers, our city spends over $30 million in contracts with the Metropolitan Police Department, and through them, contracts with private security companies to provide security at school buildings. And so, in this moment where we know that engagement with police officers are always the most positive, and that even in the most positive spaces, that police presence has resulted in negative impacts on our Black and Brown students, I think is a worthy discussion that all of us need to have. So I'll stop there and probably add a few more notes, but I know Jessica's also been involved in this conversation as well, so wanted to give her a little time to speak too.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. So I think two things you all know about me are my affinity for middle and high school students and listening to them when they tell us what they think, and then data. So between the students from Black Swan Academy and the students from Critical Exposure, just this week, I've heard quite a lot about their emotional experiences of having already had interactions with the police as middle schoolers. And about the way that makes them feel, and about specifically how that makes them feel when it is related to their schools. And so, in fact, in conversation with a staff member for Black Swan Academy, she shared that one of their high school students at Eastern, a school in my ward, was very candid about the fact that while she had a positive relationship with the SRO in her building, going out the door of Eastern every day and seeing police cruisers waiting outside the building was really stressful. And then walking to Metro and often finding herself followed by police or met with additional police presence at Metro, rather than making her feel safe and secure, made her feel under threat. So I think it's really important that we listen to young people when they tell us how they feel in the presence of police and others charged with the role of policing. The other thing I did was start digging in on data from Ward 6 schools. And so I specifically looked at the budgets for all of the Ward 6 DCPS schools, the amount of those budgets spent on security. And then John Paul's memo that he sent today, I went and looked at the number of security guards assigned and the total enrollment at the schools. So just a couple of facts, because I think they're interesting and important to discussion. There are 3 middle schools in Ward 6 in DC Public Schools, and the one with the lowest population of students, the one with the smallest number of students in the building, has the highest number of security guards. And it also has the highest at-risk population. So one of the questions is, how are we making decisions about how we allocate security resources to schools? It certainly seems that we're making assumptions about which kinds of students need more security presence. And I wonder how fair those assumptions are, and whether those assumptions are rooted in data or they're confirming priors about expectations that we may have and place on young people, which may further sort of complicate their own experience of negative schooling. The other thing I found interesting is that while all of our schools have security resources, I wanted to also look at mental health resources. And I do find it really interesting that at all of our schools in, again, DC public schools in Ward 6, because that data is just the quickest to see and compare, they all have at least double the amount of budget dedicated to mental health and social emotional personnel as they do to security resources. So that made me happy. But in that social emotional learning, they also include positions like in-school suspension coordinator. And so I wonder how much that feels like SEL to students versus feeling like disciplinarians, which may also feel like more policing. So all of this is to say, I think there's a really important discussion for our board to have about the role of policing in schools when that policing takes the form of SROs or private security firms. What else we could be spending resources on, and how we might listen more to the young people alongside their school leaders and their teachers about what to do in the face of this. I think a lot of cities have been very quick to take action, and I certainly understand that, and I understand the desire to take action quickly. I think our picture here is complex because we have some contracts with MPD, we have some private security contracts, we have 62 LEAs doing things in 61 different ways, and I think we need to make sure we get all the information and think about how to best respond. But I absolutely hope that this is an issue our state board will consider learning more about, talking more about, and figuring out how to take a position on.
Yeah, and I'll just say very quickly before we open it up is that I think it's really important for all of us to examine as we begin to have this conversation as a group, right, about why, right, at our core, right, why do we think, right, police should be in schools, right? And if it is, right, centered around student safety, and we know that there are other evidence-based practices, right, whether it's more mental health supports or restorative justice practices or expanding violence interrupters programs into schools, right? We know that there are more research-proven things that decrease the likelihood of unsafe activity inside our school buildings if we know that those are the investments we should be making, but also know that police presence both in our schools and in our communities has not prevented this type of behavior from happening, that it's just a response to it. Then we've got to really think critically about how we transform our systems and, quite frankly, our investments to more align with a student-centered approach to safety as opposed to a law and order enforcement centered philosophy of safety. And I think that that's so important. And again, given the disproportionate spread, right, of law enforcement in schools with high at-risk populations and mostly Black students, we've got to think critically about what type of school environments we're creating for the students that we say whose lives matter, but quite frankly, are not being affirmed in some of the practices that we kind of see as just kind of the status quo. So just challenging all of our colleagues as we have these conversations and as the conversations evolve, to not be afraid to challenge our natural assumptions about what safety means for our students, and to really dig deeper into how we achieve that same goal, but in a more productive way, not just for us, but for the students who we care about.
Can I say something? At Cardozo in 1995, all the campuses were open. There weren't any closed campuses in the city. And there was an altercation in the cafeteria at lunchtime, and a student who lost the altercation went outside, came back in and shot a student right on the steps, the front steps of Cardozo. Antar Hall was the name of the person who died. The next day, DC schools closed campuses. So the closed campuses started the day after Antar Hall was killed. We've always had a police officer in the building, and it's never been a problem. It was the same officer for a long time, and then after he left, it's been the same officer for up until now. As a matter of fact, at Cardozo, I think last time I went by there, he was still there. And I think that we need to make sure that when we have discussions and panels or whatever for this, and I think it's completely important that we have somebody from MPD and we have somebody from the private security firms on the panels. I don't think because we're going to get, I understand everything that's going on in this country, and I agree with everything that people are protesting about. But we need to make sure that when we're talking about it, that we have the entire group of people on the panels.
Yeah, I appreciate that point, Frazier. I'll just say I think, and I've talked about it, in various conversations over the last few days as I thought about this issue, that, right, I went to a high school where we had a school resource officer stationed inside the building, and it was the same officer for 4 years, and I had a very good and positive relationship with her. Shout out Officer Cannon. But again, I just want us to think about, just because, right, an incident, right, hasn't happened, right, just because a student hasn't, right, been abused inside of a school building, just because these things haven't happened doesn't mean that they can't. And we've got to realize that, right, as an institution, right, and I'm not demonizing police officers, but as an institution, right, the Metropolitan Police Department is also the same institution, right, that has in the last year, right, handcuffed folks who, right, handcuffed middle and elementary school students, right, have in many cases, right, brutalized young Black men and women on our streets. And because that hasn't trickled into another space in which they occupy, doesn't mean that it can't. And that, right, on average, what we see is that one student, right, nationwide, one student is abused by a police officer per week across this country. And in many of those jurisdictions, right, that's the first time it's ever happened. And so, not saying that, right, that because we've had, right, more positive experiences than not, I don't think is a fair argument, right, to say that that like getting police out of schools isn't an approach we should take. But I think, yes, like the point is taken that we've got to have a nuanced conversation about the forward direction we're going in. And if it's about, right, preventing, right, violent incidents like the one that happened at Cardozo, or it's about, right, making sure that students, right, that a student who's had a negative interaction with police officers outside don't walk into the building first thing in the morning and are re-traumatized by that experience because the first face they see is wearing a uniform and a gun, right? We've got to think about, right, how that impacts students and their learning, and how we rehash our thinking to say that there are other ways to maintain and establish safety in school communities. So again, I think we're going to have a evolving conversation over the next few weeks, but just wanted to say that.
Great. Thank you.
Can I just throw in a plug again for testifying on the 17th and 18th? It's a general budget, open to the public hearing, and I think it's a good time and place to raise these cross-sector issues, where there are other sectors that deeply influence our schools. So MP and whatever, the police department is one, but I think also one that I've been thinking about a lot is the call for canceling rent, and just what will happen if evictions start happening, once the emergency is declared over. It's going to deeply impact our families and our students. And so I think I just want to say, that this is a good opportunity to sort of bring these issues up. And one thing, just to Jessica's point about which schools get more security, I have read research, it's very disturbing that even when there are school shootings that involve white schools or predominantly white schools, that security goes up in all Black schools, that surveillance, measures are increased in majority Black schools. So it definitely is not always, or probably rarely, connected with research or actual need even. So yeah, that's all.
Emily, on that note, I'll just add, and I forgot to say this earlier, when I did this budget crunching, there are 6 schools in Ward 6 where the cost of security exceeds 3% of the budget, 1 school that exceeds 4% of the budget, and 1 school where it approaches almost 6% of the budget. So the total school budget, almost 6% of it is for security. So I do think there's real questions around, like, what is the rationale and what else? That is not fungible money. That is not money the LSAT or the principal are allowed to consider spending in other ways. So I think it's a worthwhile discussion to have around why do we place more security in some schools, and what could we be spending that money on to make students feel safe, secure, and cared for in other ways.
But to Fraser's point, I do also think there's a way to make it clear that we're hoping that, well, 2 things. One is we do need ways of keeping kids safe, especially all the safe passage issues, right? And so I think that needs to be part of any resolution we have, is like, what would take the place of police? And then the other point is, I think we do want police engaging with young people in positive ways, right? And so are there ways to do that, without triggering people who have had negative experiences? They don't necessarily need to be the guards, right? But they can be folks who engage regularly in a structured way with schools and community centers, and they should be doing that. So, and I know they do, but yeah, maybe that's more their role, is just making that point.
Yeah, just very quickly, Emily, to your point around safe passage is something I mentioned to the deputy mayor earlier this week. I know they've been doing a lot of cross-sector work on safe passage, and just encouraged him to also challenge our assumptions about how we, like, does safe passage automatically have to mean, right, the presence of law enforcement, right? Chicago runs a really good program where it's both, right, there's community-based, right, community-based credible messengers along those routes, but it's also a workforce development program for folks inside the neighborhood. And so thinking about alternatives to that, I think, will be important too. And then I'll say, given the aspect of eliciting positive interactions between young people and law enforcement. And this is something that I had a conversation with someone about earlier today, and I thought it was a good point, is that we only force Black kids to engage with the police, right? It's just like, oh, well, we want to establish more positive relationships with police and the kids in the community. So we shove Black kids in the faces of police officers and they're like, build a great relationship. Whereas that relationship should, if there's a relationship at all, right? Because a lot of our students should never have to engage with law enforcement, right? In most circumstances, but that engagement shouldn't have to be forced because of because there's negative interactions everywhere else outside that space, right? So just thinking about, how we build community without also, re-perpetuating or re-traumatizing.
I just want to counter Marcus's point about having community members in the Safe Passage program. It's something that was looked at through the chronic absenteeism task force that we're on, and we have tried to engage community members and it doesn't work, which is one of the reasons why we have such a strong connection with our MPD, especially with chronic absenteeism and our Safe Passage programs. So Chicago might be a model, but it's not working here in the ways that we've tried to engage previously.
Yeah, and I think what we've tried mostly to do, I was going to say what we've tried mostly to do is, I think, recruit volunteers for that effort. What Chicago does is a workforce development program that actually employs folks from the community, which is less of us trying to depend on folks to lean into this process as opposed to all of government approach that maintains safety without necessarily an overly dramatic presence of law enforcement. But no, I get the point. It's been very hard to recruit volunteers and community members for that effort, but I think there are alternatives for sure.
So can I just say, I am torn on all night letting people keep talking or trying to.
I need to go.
I'm closing up. I just wanted to say, I thank you all for staying through, and I feel we need a better way to do this. I didn't want to shut people down during any of these conversations, and here it is, it's 8:42. So I'll just leave it at that. The only thing I'll say about the discussions, we need to really find some good resources of people to come testify and stuff to read, because I think it's hugely complicated. And as everybody has raised, and so if we're going to take it up, we need to sort of figure out who can come testify and what we can read and so on and so on. And with that, people, are we ready?
I'd like to make a motion that we adjourn.
Yes, thank you. I wish you'd been there an hour ago, Fraser. Maybe it would have passed.
No, it was good. It was good stuff. Somebody's got to second it.
Second, I think Emily and I both have.
Okay.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. I don't even know how to get out of it.